Adventures of Harry Nile.
Chapter 1. Seattle in November is a city that never wakes. It just rolls over, pulls the gray sky over its head, and goes back to sleep. The fog off Puget Sound had rolled in thick that Tuesday morning, a heavy, salty soup that choked the streets and made the neon signs in Pioneer Square bleed like fresh wounds. I was sitting in my office on the third floor of the Murphy building, watching a couple of longshoremen argue on the pavement below. The window was cracked open, letting in the damp chill and the smell of roasting coffee, dead fish, and diesel fumes. It was the perfume of the Pacific Northwest, and it suited my mood just fine. Business was slow. Not the kind of slow where you catch up on paperwork, but the kind of slow where you start counting the cracks in the ceiling plaster and wondering how much you can get for a slightly used Smith & Wesson at the pawn shop down on Yesler. The radio on my desk was turned down low, humming a mournful brass tune that sounded exactly like the bottom of a bourbon glass. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk, pushed aside a stack of unpaid electric bills, and pulled out the bottle of Old Granddad. I poured 2 fingers into a glass that had only been mostly washed, knocked it back, and let the cheap fire burn away the morning chill. That was when I saw the shadow on the frosted glass of my office door. It was a woman's silhouette. You didn't need a detective's license to figure that out. The lines were sharp, the hat was tipped at a stylish angle, and she stood there for a long time, as if she were trying to decide whether opening the door was the best idea she'd ever had, or the worst mistake of her life. Given my track record, I was betting on the latter. She finally knocked. 2 sharp raps, polite but demanding. "The lock's broken," I called out, my voice rough from a pack-a-day Chesterfield habit. "And the collections agency already came this week. Come on in." The door swung open, and the fog seemed to follow her into the room, clinging to the hem of her dark wool coat. She was a knockout, the kind of woman who made you want to apologize for every dirty thought you'd ever had, right before you had a dozen more. She had high cheekbones, dark hair pulled back into a severe but elegant style, and eyes the color of a bruised sky. She was dressed like money, quiet, old money. The tailored suit beneath her coat didn't have a label you could buy off a rack downtown, and her shoes were Italian leather, not the sensible heels worn by the working girls on First Avenue. "Harry Nile?" she asked. Her voice was smooth, like an expensive gin poured over crushed ice. "That's what it says on the door," I replied, staying seated. I motioned to the wooden chair across from my desk. "Take a load off, Mrs. Belmont," she said, entering the room and closing the door behind her. Clara Belmont. She didn't sit immediately. She took a slow look around the office, her eyes sweeping over the overflowing ashtray, the dusty filing cabinets, and the half-empty bottle of bourbon I hadn't bothered to hide. Her nose gave a microscopic twitch, the kind a duchess might make if she accidentally stepped in something unpleasant on the sidewalk. "Not what you expected?" I asked, lighting a cigarette and tossing the match into the tray. "I was told you were effective, Mr. Nile," she said, finally taking a seat. She sat straight-backed, her knees pressed tightly together, her gloved hands resting in her lap. "I wasn't told you were tidy. I find dirt helps keep the expectations low," I said, exhaling a long, thin stream of gray smoke toward the ceiling. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Belmont? You don't look like the type to wander into this part of town just to critique the interior decorating." She took a deep breath, and the polished veneer cracked just a fraction. Her hands trembled, a tiny flutter against the dark wool of her skirt. She pressed her fingers together to stop it. "It's my husband," she said, the words coming out a little too fast. "Arthur. He's in trouble, Mr. Nile. Deep trouble." "Husbands usually are," I said mildly. "Let me guess. He found a blonde who understands him better than you do, took the Packard, and cleaned out the joint bank account." "If it were that simple, I would have hired a lawyer," she snapped, a flash of genuine anger breaking through the icy exterior. "Good. Anger I could work with. Anger told the truth better than tears ever did. Arthur isn't missing because of another woman. He's missing because someone tried to kill him." That got my attention. I sat forward, resting my elbows on the desk, the creak of the old wood breaking the sudden silence in the room. "Start from the beginning," I told her. "Who is Arthur? What does he do? And who wants to put a hole in him?" Clara Belmont opened her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a silver cigarette case. She didn't offer me one. She extracted a thin white stick, and I leaned across the desk to offer a light from my Zippo. Her hand was steady now as she leaned into the flame, the scent of expensive jasmine perfume mixing with the sharp sulfur of the lighter fluid. "Arthur is a bookkeeper," she said, exhaling a cloud of smoke that immediately tangled with my own. "He works for Pacific Consolidated Freight, down on the docks. He's been there 12 years. He's a quiet man, Mr. Nile. He likes his crossword puzzles. He listens to the baseball games on the radio, and he goes to bed by 10 o'clock every night. He doesn't drink, he doesn't gamble, and he doesn't have enemies." "Everyone has enemies, Mrs. Belmont," I said softly. "Some people just don't know it yet. What happened?" "Last night," she began, her eyes dropping to the desk. "He was supposed to be home by 6. We live on Queen Anne Hill. By 8 o'clock I was worried. By 10 I was frantic. I called the office, but there was no answer. I was just about to call the police when the telephone rang." She paused, taking another drag of her cigarette. Ash glowed cherry red in the dim light of the office. "It was Arthur," she continued, her voice dropping an octave. "He sounded terrible, out of breath, panicked. He told me he couldn't come home. He said someone had followed him from the freight yard. He said they shot him, Mr. Nile. He told me he was hiding, but he wouldn't tell me where. He just said I needed to stay in the house, lock the doors, and wait for him to contact me again." "And did he?" I asked. "No." She looked up, her blue eyes pleading. "I waited up all night. Nothing. This morning, I went to the garage to see if his car was there. It wasn't, but I found this." She reached back into her handbag and pulled out a crumpled piece of fabric. She tossed it onto my desk. It was a man's white dress shirt, or at least it was. Now it was stained with dark, rust-colored patches of dried blood, mostly concentrated around the left shoulder. I picked up a pencil and used the eraser end to push the fabric around, examining the tears and the spread of the stain. "He's hurt," she whispered. "I don't know how badly, but he's out there alone and he's terrified." "If someone took a shot at him, why didn't he go to the cops?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "The Seattle Police Department has a lot of flaws, but they generally frown on people getting shot in the streets." "He said he couldn't," Clara replied quickly. Too quickly. He said he couldn't trust them, that the people who were after him had connections." "Connections," I repeated flatly. "A bookkeeper for a freight company. What kind of numbers is Arthur crunching, Mrs. Belmont? Because guys who do payroll and manage shipping manifests don't usually end up dodging lead in the middle of the night." "I told you, he's just a bookkeeper," she insisted, her voice rising. "He manages the warehouse accounts. It's tedious, boring work. I don't know why anyone would want to hurt him." I looked at her. I looked at the tailored suit, the Italian shoes, the silver cigarette case, and the diamond ring on her left hand that was big enough to choke a horse. "How much does Pacific Consolidated pay a mid-level bookkeeper these days?" I asked casually. "Must be a booming industry." She stiffened. "Arthur makes a comfortable living. We do well for ourselves." "You do very well," I noted, gesturing with my cigarette toward her wrist. When she had reached for the lighter, her sleeve had pulled back just enough to reveal a platinum watch studded with small sapphires. "That timepiece alone is worth about 2 years of a comfortable living on the docks. So let's try this again, Mrs. Belmont. And this time, let's skip the part where we pretend Arthur is just a humble pencil pusher. People who live on Queen Anne Hill and wear platinum watches don't get there by playing it straight on a bookkeeper's salary." Her jaw tightened. She took a slow, deliberate breath, visibly rebuilding the walls I had just kicked down. "My family had money, Mr. Nile," she said coldly. "An inheritance. Arthur's salary pays the light bill. My family's money pays for the rest." It was a good lie. It was smooth. It made logical sense, and she delivered it without blinking. But it was a lie all the same. The way she held her purse, the slight hesitation before she mentioned the inheritance, it was a rehearsed line. She was hiding something, and whatever it was the real reason Arthur was bleeding in an alley somewhere. "Fine," I said, deciding to let her keep her secrets for now. If she wanted to play a rigged game, I was more than happy to deal the cards. "So, Arthur is missing, he's wounded, and he thinks the cops are dirty. You want me to find him before the guys with the guns do?" "Exactly." She reached into her bag one last time and pulled out a thick envelope. She dropped it on the desk next to the bloody shirt. There's $500 in there. Another $500 when you bring him home safely. $1,000. That was the kind of money that could make a man forget to ask too many questions. It could pay the rent, settle the tab at O'Malley's bar, and keep me in cheap bourbon in Chesterfields until Christmas. I picked up the envelope and thumbed through the crisp green bills. They smelled like a bank vault, not a trace of dockside dirt on them. I charge $50 a day plus expenses, I told her, slipping the envelope into my inside jacket pocket. This buys you a lot of days. Do you have a recent photograph of Arthur? She nodded, producing a small black and white snapshot from her purse. She slid it across the desk. I picked it up. Arthur Belmont looked exactly like a man who shouldn't be dodging bullets. He had thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the nervous, slightly apologetic smile of a man who was used to apologizing for things he hadn't done. He looked soft. The streets would eat a guy like Arthur alive. Where was he supposed to be before he went to the freight yard yesterday? I asked. He had lunch downtown, Clara said. He told me he was meeting a client at the Olympic Hotel. After that, he was going straight to the office. All right. I stood up, grabbing my worn trench coat off the coat rack in the corner. Go home, Mrs. Belmont. Lock your doors, pull the shades, and stay by the telephone. If he calls again, you tell him to sit tight and you call me. Don't go looking for him yourself. She stood, buttoning her dark coat. The panic from earlier was completely gone now, replaced by the cool, aristocratic exterior she had walked in with. You'll find him, Mr. Nile. I'll find him, I said, shrugging into my coat. It just depends on what condition he's in when I do. She didn't like that, but she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and left the office, her expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. I waited until the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall before I picked up the bloody shirt. The blood was dry, but the fabric smelled faintly of oil, salt water, and something else. I lifted it closer to my nose. Gunpowder. And beneath that, barely there but unmistakable, the cheap, sweet scent of gardenia perfume. Clara Belmont wore jasmine. Arthur, the mild-mannered bookkeeper, had been keeping secrets of his own. I grabbed my fedora, turned off the radio, and shut the office door behind me. The fog was waiting for me outside, thick and heavy, but the streets were already starting to talk. I just needed to find the right people to listen to. I decided to start with the Olympic Hotel. If a guy like Arthur was playing out of his league, he was bound to leave a trail of very expensive, very dangerous breadcrumbs. I pulled my collar up against the damp chill, lit another cigarette, and stepped out into the gray afternoon. The case had walked in. Now the real work began. Chapter 2. The chandelier hanging in the center of the Olympic Hotel lobby looked like a frozen explosion of crystal and brass. It was the kind of place where the carpets were thick enough to swallow your shoes, and the air smelled of imported cigars, expensive floor wax, and the quiet, unshakable arrogance of old money. I walked in through the heavy revolving doors, my damp trench coat dripping a trail of working-class water onto the imported Italian marble. I felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a pedigree dog show. A bellhop in a crisp, brass-buttoned uniform gave me a look that suggested he wanted to call the exterminators. I gave him a tired smile that suggested he really shouldn't try it. He swallowed whatever smart remark he was chewing on, and abruptly found something very interesting to look at on the ceiling. I bypassed the front desk and headed straight for the Georgian room. It was barely 2 in the afternoon, but the hotel's premier watering hole had pulled its heavy velvet drapes tight against the Seattle gloom. The room was bathed in the warm amber glow of frosted wall sconces, designed to make the patrons look wealthier and the whiskey look older. The maitre d' stood behind a polished mahogany podium, a tall, impossibly thin man with a pencil mustache and a tuxedo that fit him better than my own skin fit me. He watched me approach with the enthusiasm of a man watching a tax audit walk through the door. "May I help you, sir?" he asked. The "sir" sounded like a curse word wrapped in silk. "I'm looking for a bartender," I said, leaning an elbow on his podium. "Guy named Eddie. Used to work the late shift at the Blue Note before he decided to move up in the world." The maitre d' bristled, his spine snapping straight. "Our bar staff are occupied serving our clientele. If you'd like a table, there is a dress code." "And if I want information, there's a fee," I replied. I reached into my coat pocket, bypassing Clara Belmont's thick envelope, and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill from my own meager stash. I flattened it on the mahogany surface and slid it under his impeccably manicured thumb. Just point me to Eddie, I'll stay off the upholstery. The 5 disappeared with the speed of a pickpocket working a crowded bus. The maitre d' didn't even blink. He just tilted his head toward the far end of the long, curved mahogany bar. Eddie was polishing a highball glass, looking exactly the same as he did 3 years ago, just in a cleaner shirt. He was a fireplug of a man with a flattened nose he'd earned in the amateur boxing rings of Tacoma. He saw me coming, and a weary grin spread across his battered face. "Harry Nile," Eddie said, setting the glass down and tossing his rag over his shoulder. "I thought they banned you from this zip code." "They tried, Eddie. I slipped under the wire," I said, sliding onto a leather barstool that cost more than my car. "The place looks good on you, less blood on the floor than the Blue Note." "Pays better too," Eddie chuckled, leaning his forearms on the bar. "What's your poison, Harry? I can't serve you the rotgut you usually drink. It would violate the health code." "Just water for now, Eddie. I'm working." Eddie raised a thick eyebrow. "Working? That usually means somebody is bleeding, crying, or lying. Which one is it today?" "Maybe all 3, I said. I pulled out the black and white snapshot of Arthur Belmont and slid it across the polished wood. "I'm looking for this guy. My name is Arthur. Said he had a lunch meeting here yesterday." Eddie squinted at the photograph, his forehead wrinkling into deep trenches. He tapped a thick finger against the bar. "Yeah, I remember him. Hard guy to forget in a place like this. Looked like a rabbit that wandered into a fox den. He was sitting right where you are, sweating through a cheap wool suit and tearing a cocktail napkin into tiny little pieces." "Was he alone?" I asked, pulling out my Zippo and flipping the lid open and shut, a nervous habit I'd never bothered to break. "For the first 20 minutes, Eddie said. Ordered a ginger ale, didn't touch it, kept looking at the clock over the mirror. Then his meeting showed up. And it wasn't the kind of guy who usually drinks at the Olympics," Eddie said, lowering his voice a notch. He grabbed a rag and started wiping an imaginary spot on the bar. "Big fella, built like a brick wall with a bad attitude, wore a gray fedora pulled down low, and a suit that cost a lot of money but still managed to look cheap on him. He had a cauliflower ear, left side, heavy," I murmured. "Arthur Belmont, mild-mannered bookkeeper, having lunch with a muscle boy. That's a strange pairing. Did you catch a name?" "The big guy called the rabbit Artie. The rabbit didn't look happy about it." Eddie paused, glancing down the bar to make sure nobody was listening. They kept their voices low, but it wasn't a friendly chat. The big guy did most of the talking. He kept tapping his finger on the bar. I noticed he was missing the top half of his left pinky finger, cut clean off, missing half a pinky. That was a hard physical clue, the kind that didn't wash off in the rain. "What were they arguing about?" "Couldn't hear the words, just the music," Eddie said. But right before they left, the big guy pulled something out of his pocket and shoved it into the rabbit's chest. Said something like, "Tell the boss the timeline doesn't hold. We need the books cleaned by Friday." Then he walked out. "What did he shove at him?" "Looked like a matchbook," Eddie said with a shrug. "Bright red cover." The rabbit shoved it in his pocket, threw $1 on the bar, and ran out like his pants were on fire. "A red matchbook, a guy with half a pinky, and cooked books," I said, slipping the photograph back into my pocket. "Eddie, you're a scholar and a gentleman." "I'm just a guy pouring drinks, Harry. You watch your step. Guys missing fingers usually lose them doing things that get other people killed. I'll keep that in mind." I stood up, gave Eddie a 2-finger salute, and walked back out through the lobby, leaving the scent of old money behind. Outside, the fog had thinned out, replaced by a cold, spiteful drizzle that felt like needles against the skin. I turned up the collar of my coat, pulled my fedora down tight, and started walking south toward the precinct. The streets of Seattle were a messy symphony of blaring car horns, rattling streetcars, and the low, distant blast of foghorns out on Elliott Bay. I needed a cop. Specifically, I needed a cop who knew the underside of the docks well enough to navigate the slime, but who wasn't so dirty that he'd sell me out for a nickel. That narrowed the list to one name, Detective Sergeant Frank Loomis. I found Loomis right where I knew he'd be at 3 in the afternoon. The Pike Street dinette was a greasy spoon squeezed between a pawn shop and a defunct vaudeville theater. It was a place where the coffee tasted like boiled pennies and the meatloaf was legally classified as a mystery meat. It was also 2 blocks from the precinct, making it the unofficial cafeteria for homicide detectives who hated their wives. The bell above the door jingled a flat note as I walked in. The air was thick with the smell of old frying grease, stale cigarette smoke, and despair. Loomis was sitting in a back booth, his massive frame hunched over a plate of half-eaten cherry pie. He was a bulldog of a man, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite with a dull chisel. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was loosened, and his eyes had the permanent bloodshot glaze of a man who hadn't slept a full 8 hours since the attack on Pearl Harbor. I slipped into the booth opposite him. He didn't look up. He just kept rhythmically stabbing a fork into his pie. "You're blocking my light, Nile," Loomis grumbled, his voice sounding like gravel rattling around in a cement mixer. "You don't need light to eat that poison, Frank. You just need a strong stomach and a good life insurance policy," I said, signaling the waitress for 2 coffees. Loomis finally looked up, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Harry? I'm off the clock in 20 minutes, and I don't have the patience for whatever half-baked private snoop garbage you're dragging through my diner." "I'm touched by the warm welcome," I said. The waitress, a tired-looking woman named Betty, dropped 2 thick ceramic mugs of black coffee on the Formica table without breaking stride. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my frozen knuckles. "I need a name, Frank. I figure you owe me." Loomis scoffed, leaning back against the cracked vinyl of the booth. "I don't owe you a damn thing." "Sure you do. Last year, the councilman's daughter and the stolen Buick," I reminded him softly. "I handed you the keys, I handed you the perp, and I kept your name completely out of the papers when the brass tried to bury the whole mess. You got a commendation, I got a bruised rib." Loomis glared at me, his jaw working as he chewed on a piece of crust. He knew I was right, and it annoyed the hell out of him. "Fine, one name, what is it?" "I need to know about Pacific Consolidated Freight, down on the docks." Loomis stopped chewing. He slowly lowered his fork to the plate, the casual annoyance in his eyes vanishing, replaced by a sudden razor-sharp focus. He leaned across the table, his massive shoulders blocking the diner around us. "You don't want to mess with Pacific Consolidated, Harry," Loomis said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That's not a company. That's a hornet's nest." "Who owns it?" I pressed. "On paper? A holding company out of Chicago. In reality? Marcus Thorne runs it." The name hit the table like a lead weight. Marcus Thorne was no mere businessman. He was the uncrowned king of the Seattle waterfront. If it moved by ship, truck, or rail, Thorne took a cut. If he didn't get his cut, things had a habit of catching fire in the middle of the night. "Thorne," I muttered, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "That explains the connections. I'm looking for a bookkeeper who works there. Name of Arthur Belmont. Seems he got himself a bullet in the shoulder last night." Loomis let out a dry, humorless laugh. "A bookkeeper for Thorne? Buddy, those books are cooked so thoroughly they're charred. The feds have been reviewing Thorne's ledgers for 3 years. If this Belmont character is holding the pencil, he knows exactly where every dirty dime is buried. And if he's bleeding, it means Thorne thinks he's getting ready to sing. Or Belmont found out he was being set up to take a fall," I said, piecing it together. "The big guy at the hotel with the missing pinky. The timeline that didn't hold. Frank, you know a muscle guy in Thorne's crew? Big cauliflower ear on the left, missing the top half of his left pinky finger?" Loomis didn't even have to think. "That's Mickey the Mute O'Bannon. He doesn't talk much, mostly because he lets his knuckles do the communicating. He's Thorne's shadow. If O'Bannon is involved, Thorne ordered it personally." The picture was getting clearer, but there was still a smudge on the lens. I thought about the bloody shirt sitting on my desk back at the office, the smell of the docks, the smell of gunpowder, and the perfume. "One more thing, Frank. Gardenia perfume. Cheap, heavy, smells like a funeral parlor. Does Thorne have a girl who bathes in the stuff?" Loomis frowned, staring at his coffee. "Thorne doesn't keep steady company, but the perfume, yeah. There's a joint a few blocks up from the freight yards, a dive bar called the Blue Gardenia. It's a known Thorne hangout. The waitresses there wear it. Management makes 'em. Supposed to be their signature gimmick." "The Blue Gardenia," I repeated, the name rolling off my tongue like a bad omen. Arthur Belmont hadn't just been hiding out on the docks. He had been tangled in Thorne's personal playground. "You stay away from Thorne, Harry," Loomis warned, grabbing his check and sliding out of the booth. He threw some coins on the table. You go poking around the Blue Gardenia, asking about cooked books and missing bookkeepers. They won't just break your nose. They'll put you in an oil drum and drop you in the Sound, and I won't dive in to fish you out. You're a true friend, Frank, I told him. Loomis pushed through the diner doors and disappeared into the gray afternoon. I sat there for a minute, finishing the terrible coffee. Clara Belmont was playing me, Arthur Belmont was playing Thorne, and Thorne was playing for keeps. I pulled out a Chesterfield, lit it, and watched the smoke drift toward the grease-stained ceiling. The setup was a classic squeeze, but I needed to find the red matchbook, and I needed to find Arthur before Mickey O'Bannon finished the job. I threw a dime on the table, stood up, and headed back out into the rain. The streets had talked. Now, it was time to take a trip down to the waterfront. It was time to visit the Blue Gardenia and see how deadly a flower could be. Chapter 3. The sky had cracked open by nightfall, shedding the dreary afternoon clouds to reveal a canopy of hard, glittering stars. The temperature plummeted fast, turning the damp Seattle streets into treacherous sheets of black ice. It was a bitter, biting cold, the kind of freezing frost that turned the exhaust falling from the tailpipes of passing cars into thick white plumes and made your own breath look like cheap cigarette smoke hanging in the air. I walked south toward the waterfront, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn trench coat, my collar turned up against the wind that was currently whipping off Elliott Bay like a sharpened razor. The air smelled of frozen brine, dead fish, and engine oil. It was a clear, beautiful night to freeze to death. Down on Alaskan Way, the docks were usually a hive of shadowy activity, a place where things fell off trucks and disappeared into the sprawling warehouses. But tonight, one particular spot was lit up brighter than a Hollywood movie premiere. The neon sign for the Blue Gardenia flickered in a sickly, pulsating violet, throwing long, bruising shadows across the frost-covered brick of the alleyway next to it. It wasn't the neon that had drawn a crowd. It was the cherry-red flash of 3 police cruisers parked haphazardly onto the sidewalk, their engines idling hot in the freezing air. I ducked under the yellow police tape before the shivering uniform cop on the perimeter could tell me to scream. I flashed my private investigator's license, a battered piece of paper that usually bought me about 30 seconds of tolerance, and walked through the heavy padded leather double doors of the club. The smell hit me first. It was a thick, cloying wave of cheap gardenia perfume, practically weaponized to cover up the stale beer, vomit, and fear that usually permeated joints like this. Tonight, there was a new scent added to the house blend, the sharp, unmistakable, metallic tang of copper and freshly burnt cordite. The interior of the Blue Gardenia was exactly what you'd expect from a mob-run dive catering to sailors and longshoremen. Cracked red leather booths lined the walls. Sticky floors were coated in a thin layer of sawdust, and a small stage in the corner sat empty, an upright piano looking abandoned under a single harsh spotlight. But the real show was behind the long, curved mahogany bar. Detective Sergeant Frank Loomis was standing by the cash register, an unlit cigar wedged firmly in the corner of his mouth. For a man who usually looked like the weight of the world was resting squarely on his shoulders, tonight he looked positively cheerful. "I told you not to come down here, Nile," Loomis rumbled, though there was no real bite to his gravelly voice. He didn't look angry, he looked relieved. "I have a hard time following directions, Frank," I said, stepping over a shattered bottle of gin. "Looks like you had a busy evening." "I came for a drink, but I guess the service is suspended." Loomis snorted, gesturing with a massive hand toward the space behind the bar. "You could say that." The bartender clocked out early, permanently. I stepped around the edge of the polished wood and looked down. She was sprawled out on the duckboards, a young woman in a short, ruffled waitress uniform that probably hadn't been warm enough even before the temperature dropped. She had bottle blonde hair that had fanned out over a pool of dark, slowly congealing blood. 2 bullet holes marred the front of her uniform, clustered tight in the center of her chest. Professional work, or at least lucky work. I knelt down, the joints in my knees popping loudly in the quiet room. Her name tag, pinned slightly askew, read Ruby. The smell of gardenia perfume radiating from her skin was so strong it practically made my eyes water. "Is this the one?" I asked softly. "The one who bathed in the perfume?" Loomis nodded, chewing his cigar. "Yeah, Ruby Masters. I worked here for 2 years. A tough girl, but not tough enough to stop a .38 caliber slug. "Who called it in?" I asked, standing back up and brushing the sawdust from my trousers. "A couple of dock hands drinking in the back booth. They heard the shots, saw a guy bolt out the alley door, and yelled for a beat cop walking his route on Alaskan Way," Loomis explained, a rare smile actually touching the corners of his mouth. "The beat cop was sharp. Chased the rabbit down 3 blocks and tackled him into a stack of shipping pallets." "You caught the shooter?" I raised an eyebrow. "That was fast. Too fast. In my line of work, a neatly wrapped package usually meant there was a bomb inside." "Caught him red-handed, Harry," Loomis said, practically gloating. He gestured toward the back office of the club. "We got him cuffed to a radiator pipe back there, clear as day. We don't even have to sweat him. The dumb bastard is already doing the talking for us." "Who is it?" "Benny Rivas, a small-time dock rat and occasional enforcer for some of the local bookies," Loomis said, pulling out a small notepad. "Turns out Benny and our dead girl here were an item, a volatile item. The dockhands said they heard them arguing loudly before the shots were fired." I pulled a Chesterfield from the crumpled pack in my pocket and lit it, ignoring the glare from a crime scene photographer who was busy setting up his flashbulbs. "A lover's quarrel, how terribly poetic. Did he have the gun?" "In his coat pocket," Loomis said, tapping his pen against his pad. "A Smith & Wesson .38, 2 rounds missing. Barrel was still warm when the beat cop dragged him in. Plus, Benny Boy has Ruby's blood smeared all over the cuffs of his shirt and his hands." "Sounds like you've got it all figured out, Frank. Why the big grin? Since when do you enjoy domestic homicides?" Loomis stepped closer, lowering his voice so the uniforms bustling around the room wouldn't hear. "Because, Nile, this happened in a bar owned by Marcus Thorne. When I got the call, I figured I was walking into a mob hit. I figured I'd have to spend the next 3 months hitting a brick wall, trying to pin a murder on a guy who buys judges for breakfast. But this is a simple crime of passion, a jealous boyfriend with a hot temper and a loaded gun. Thorne's got nothing to do with it. The precinct captain is going to love it. The DA is going to love it. It's an easy close. I'll be home in bed by midnight." "Mind if I take a look at the prize catch?" I asked, exhaling a thin stream of gray smoke toward the tin ceiling. Loomis hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You don't touch him, Harry, and you don't muddy the waters. The guy is practically a closed file." "I just want to see what a closed file looks like before it hits the prosecutor's desk," I said, walking past Loomis toward the back hallway. The door to the manager's office was propped open. Inside, 2 uniformed cops were standing guard over a man slumped on a wooden chair. Benny Rivas looked exactly like a man whose entire life had just caved in on him. He was a skinny, rat-faced guy in a cheap, wet suit, shivering violently despite the steam hissing from the radiator he was handcuffed to. His face was a roadmap of bad choices, currently slick with sweat and tears. His hands, shackled to the heavy iron pipe, were indeed stained with streaks of rust-colored blood. When I walked in, Benny jerked his head up, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely manic. He looked like an animal caught in a snare, gnawing off its own leg in a panic. "I didn't do it," Benny shrieked, his voice cracking loudly in the small, cramped office. "I told the big guy. I told him all. I didn't shoot her." "Save it for the judge, Benny," one of the uniformed cops muttered, looking bored. I stepped closer, leaning against the doorframe, letting my cigarette dangle from my lips. "You didn't shoot her, Benny." "That's a tough story to sell when you were caught running down an alley with the murder weapon in your pocket and her blood on your knuckles." Benny strained against the handcuffs, the metal clinking sharply against the pipe. "I found her like that, I swear to God. I came to the back door to talk to her. We were fighting earlier, yeah. I was mad, real mad." "What were you fighting about?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and conversational. "She was leaving," Benny sobbed, his chest heaving. "She had a suitcase packed in the break room. Said she was leaving Seattle tonight. Said she came into some money, a big payout from some pencil-pushing square she'd been doing favors for." Pencil-pushing square, Arthur Belmont, the invisible thread connecting the bloody shirt in my office to the dead girl on the floor, was pulling taut. "So she was leaving you," I said coldly, "and you didn't like that. You got a temper, Benny. Everyone on the docks knows it. You pulled your piece, she laughed at you, and you let her have it." "No," Benny screamed, thrashing wildly in the chair. "I pulled the gun. Yeah, I pulled it. I wanted to scare her. I wanted to show her she couldn't just walk out on me. But I put it back. I went to the alley to smoke and chill. I was there for 10 minutes. When I came back inside, she was on the floor. And the gun? I pressed. It was on the floor next to her. Benny cried, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. I saw the blood. I grabbed her, tried to shake her awake, but she was gone. I panicked. I saw my gun on the floor. I grabbed it, shoved it in my pocket, and I ran. I just ran. He broke into pathetic, heaving sobs, his forehead resting against the cold iron of the radiator. He looked guilty. He acted guilty. He had motive, means, and opportunity. He had confessed to the fight, to pulling the weapon, to having her blood on his hands. It was the kind of neat, tidy package that juries devoured in an hour and a half before breaking for an early lunch. Loomis stepped into the doorway behind me, looking smug. He's been singing that same tune since we dragged him in. I found her like that. It's the oldest lie in the book, Harry. A guy catches his girl packing a bag with another man's money. He sees red. I looked at Benny, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. Then I looked past him, scanning the small office. The desk was cluttered with ledgers, half-empty bottles of cheap rye, and overflowing ashtrays. Yeah, Frank, I said slowly, taking a final drag of my cigarette before dropping it onto the linoleum and crushing it beneath the heel of my boot. It's an easy close, almost too easy. Don't start with me, Nile, Loomis warned, his smug expression faltering. We got the shooter. We got the motive. I'm not letting you spin this into some wild goose chase just so you can justify billing your rich client for another day of work. I'm not spinning anything, I replied, turning away from the weeping suspect. You're a good cop, Frank. And Benny here. He's exactly the kind of dummy who would shoot his girl in a fit of rage and then run down a blind alley with the gun. Exactly, Loomis grunted. But if he shot her, I said softly, looking back out toward the bar, where the crime scene photographer was popping another blinding white flash. Why does the whole thing feel like a stage play where someone else wrote the script? Loomis didn't answer. He didn't want to. He just wanted to go home. I pushed past him, walking back out through the club. The scent of gardenia perfume was making me slightly nauseous now. I stepped over the police tape and pushed the heavy leather doors open, walking back out into the freezing, clear night. The pavement ice crackled loudly under my boots. The sky above was beautiful, vast, and indifferent. The police had their man. The DA would get a conviction. Marcus Thorne would keep his hands perfectly clean. But as I walked back toward the blinking neon lights of Pioneer Square, the cold air couldn't numb the nagging feeling in my gut. Benny Rivas was a loser. A violent, jealous loser. But he wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a patsy, a convenient, obvious suspect, dropped right into the laps of a police department desperate for an easy answer. And if Benny didn't shoot Ruby, someone else did. Someone who knew exactly how to make it look like a crime of passion. Someone who was tying up loose ends, starting with the waitress who knew too much about a missing bookkeeper named Arthur Belmont. I lit another cigarette, shielding the flame of my Zippo against the bitter wind. The case hadn't closed. It had just been cracked wide open, and the ugly truth was pouring out onto the frozen streets of Seattle. The police could have their easy close. I was going to find the gap. Chapter 4. The digital clock on the dashboard of my battered Plymouth read 4:15 a.m. when I parked it half a block away from Arthur Belmont's upscale residence on Queen Anne Hill. The engine ticked loudly as it cooled, a metallic ping 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 breaking the dead silence of the pre-dawn hours. Up here, away from the reeking brine and diesel of the waterfront, the air was crisp, clean, and bitingly cold. Frost coated the manicured lawns and clung to the wrought iron fences like a delicate layer of powdered sugar. The houses were big, stately colonials and Tudors sitting back behind deep setbacks, places where people slept soundly behind heavy deadbolts and dreamed of rising stock prices and country club memberships. I sat there in the dark, nursing a lukewarm cup of bitter coffee from a paper container, and letting a Chesterfield burn down between my fingers. The house across the street, number 412, was dark, save for a faint amber glow coming from a lamp inside an upstairs bedroom window. Clara Belmont was still up, or maybe she was too scared to turn off the lights. Earlier that night, after leaving the bloody chaos of the blue gardenia and listening to Benny Rivas sob his heart out to a radiator pipe, my brain hadn't wanted to shut down. The puzzle pieces were floating around in my skull like loose change in a dryer, banging against each other, refusing to snap together. Benny was a patsy, gift-wrapped and delivered to the precinct with a bow on top. The cops bought it because they wanted to. It wrapped up a murder in a mob-tied bar with zero paperwork and zero heat rolling back toward Marcus Thorne. But small physical details had started to nag at me, the kind of tiny insignificant trash that stays behind when the circus packs up and leaves town. I killed the engine, slipped out of the Plymouth into the freezing damp, and walked across the quiet asphalt. I kept to the deep shadows cast by the sprawling oak trees lining the sidewalk. My trenchcoat collar was pulled up high, and my hands were buried deep in my pockets, gripping the heavy weight of my Smith & Wesson just in case the neighborhood watch was feeling particularly aggressive tonight. I didn't go to the front door. Front doors are for salesmen and process servers. Instead, I slipped down the narrow flagstone walkway that ran along the side of the Belmont house, past a row of neatly trimmed evergreen bushes that looked like frozen soldiers standing at attention, and into the dark, secluded backyard. The back patio was quiet, dominated by a large brick chimney and a sliding glass sunroom that looked out over the steep slope of the hill toward the distant shimmering lights of Lake Union. Everything was locked up tight, but I wasn't looking for a way inside the house. I was looking for the garage. It stood a dozen yards away from the main structure, a detached two-car building painted the same tasteful slate gray as the house. I tried the side service door, unlocked. Arthur Belmont might have been a nervous wreck when he fled his home with a bullet in his shoulder, but he was apparently too panicked to remember to secure his own tool shed. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me with barely a click. The interior smelled of gasoline, motor oil, fresh-cut cedar, and expensive floor wax. It was pitch black, the kind of heavy, absolute dark where your eyes strain to find shapes that aren't really there. I didn't want to flick on my Zippo, open flames in a room smelling of high-octane fuel, or a quick way to turn a private investigation into an unannounced trip to the morgue. I pulled a small metal penlight from my pocket, clicked the button, and swept the narrow beam of white light across the floor. The garage was surprisingly tidy. A riding lawnmower sat neatly in the corner under a canvas cover. A workbench running along the back wall was organized down to the millimeter. Screwdrivers lined up by size, wrenches hanging on a pegboard with their silhouettes painted white behind them, so you'd instantly notice if one went missing. It was the workspace of a man who loved order, control, and absolute predictability. Which brought me to the empty space where a car should have been. Clara had told me yesterday morning that Arthur's car was gone, that she had walked out here and found it missing right after she discovered the bloody shirt. But a missing car leaves a very specific kind of ghost town in a garage. I swept the penlight beam down to the concrete floor where the vehicle's tires would have rested. I walked over and crouched down, bringing the light in close. The concrete floor was dusty. A fine layer of gray grit, mixed with a little dried mud and dead leaves blown in from the driveway, covered the entire surface of the garage, except for two long, clean tracks where rubber tires had rolled out. I stood up and walked back toward the workbench, my eyes scanning the small items scattered across the surface. A tin of wood putty, a box of galvanized nails, a roll of electrical tape, and an old glass jar filled with rusted washers and old bolts. That was when I saw it. Lying half-hidden beneath a greasy shop rag near the corner of the bench was a matchbook. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up. I reached down, careful not to disturb the rag too much, and picked it up. It was a matchbook with a bright red cover. Embossed on the front in gold foil were the words, "The Blue Gardenia, Cocktails and Dining." I flipped it open. 3 matches were gone, torn cleanly from the cardboard comb. The remaining matches sat untouched. It was an exact match, no pun intended, to the kind of matchbook Eddie had described Arthur holding at the Olympic Hotel while he was whispering to Mickey O'Bannon, the muscle man with the missing pinky. Arthur Belmont had been at the Blue Gardenia, not just as a customer and not just as a casual visitor. He had matches from the joint sitting right here on his workbench in his quiet, respectable suburban garage on Queen Anne Hill. I slipped the red matchbook into my pocket alongside Clara's retainer envelope and kept searching. If Arthur was hiding secrets out here, the garage was going to tell me what they were. Bookkeepers don't just keep ledgers in office buildings downtown. Sometimes they keep the real set right where they can hide them from the prying eyes of wives and business partners. I checked the drawers of the workbench. The first 3 were locked with cheap brass padlocks, but a quick flick of my pocketknife's flathead screwdriver popped the old flimsy latches without even breaking the wood. Inside the first drawer, spare keys, a collection of old fountain pens, and a receipt from a hardware store in Ballard, dated 3 weeks ago. Inside the second drawer, personal tax forms, bank statements, and insurance policies. I pulled the bank statements out and flipped through them under the narrow beam of my penlight. Pacific Consolidated Freight was listed as his employer, with a steady, predictable monthly deposit of $450. Not chump change, but certainly not the kind of money that bought platinum watches studded with sapphires, Italian leather shoes, and expensive designer suits for an aristocratic wife with a fabricated inheritance story. The math didn't add up. The columns were crooked. I shoved the bank statements back and pulled open the third drawer. It was deeper than the others, lined with green felt. Inside sat a heavy black metal strongbox. It didn't have a keyhole. It had a combination dial on the front, set into a small brass plate, a combination lock, on a workbench in a garage. I whistled softly under my breath. Mild-mannered bookkeepers don't keep locked metal boxes in their tool sheds, unless they're hiding something they're terrified someone else might find. I sat down on a plastic milk crate resting beside the workbench, pulled a fresh Chesterfield from my pocket, and lit it, ignoring the tiny voice in my head telling me about the gasoline fumes. I needed to open that box, and I needed to do it before the sun came up and the neighborhood started waking up to water their lawns and fetch the morning paper. Opening a combination lock without the numbers usually requires either an acetylene torch or a very cooperative safecracker. I didn't have a torch, and my usual safecracker contact, a guy named One-Eyed Louie, was currently serving a 3-year bid in Walla Walla for fencing stolen radiator caps, so I had to rely on the next best thing, human psychology. People who use combinations don't use random numbers generated by a machine. They use numbers that mean something to them, numbers they're terrified of forgetting because they're too lazy to write them down. Anniversaries, birthdays, street numbers, or military service dates. I pulled out the notepad where I had scribbled notes from my conversation with Clara. Arthur and Clara had been married 12 years, she said. I tried their wedding anniversary date, 0614. I spun the dial, slammed the latch. Nothing. The box stayed shut like a clam in January. I tried Clara's birthday, which I guessed based on a casual remark she made about being a summer baby. Still nothing. I sat there in the dark, smoking the cigarette down to the filter, watching the ash grow long and gray. I thought about Arthur Belmont, a quiet man who liked crossword puzzles, listened to baseball games on the radio, and went to bed by 10 o'clock. A man who sat across from a thug missing half a pinky finger in the luxurious Georgian room of the Olympic Hotel. A man who was currently bleeding out somewhere in the rainy sprawl of Seattle while his wife sat across the street in a dark Colonial, waiting for a phone call that might never come. What does a quiet, nervous bookkeeper care about more than anything else? Numbers, columns that balance, balances that match the exact penny. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked closely at the brass faceplate of the strongbox. Above the combination dial, stamped directly into the metal, was a tiny serial number, 1941. 1941, the year the United States entered the war, or maybe the year Arthur started at Pacific Consolidated Freight. I reached out, my fingers steady despite the biting chill in the garage, and spun the dial. I dialed 1941. I pressed the heavy brass thumb latch down. Click. The latch gave way with a satisfying mechanical snap. The lid of the strongbox popped open a fraction of an inch, released by an internal spring. I exhaled a long cloud of smoke, feeling a small surge of triumph that tasted almost as good as a fresh glass of bourbon. I lifted the lid all the way back. Inside, resting on a bed of folded velvet, was a stack of legal-sized documents tied together with a faded pink ribbon, a handful of newspaper clippings, and a small, heavy leather-bound ledger book with the words Pacific Consolidated Freight, Internal Audit embossed on the cover in peeling gold leaf. I picked up the ledger and flipped it open to the first page. The penlight beam illuminated rows and rows of neat handwritten columns of figures, but these weren't the boring, mundane payroll numbers Arthur showed his bosses at the warehouse. These numbers were red, heavy, aggressive red ink, tracking shipments of cargo that didn't exist on the official manifest. Unmarked crates moving through the docks under cover of darkness, routed through shell companies, bypassing port tariffs and federal tax inspectors entirely. And right there, at the bottom of the page, scrawled in Arthur's neat, precise handwriting, was a note. Thorne's cut verified. Balance short by $45,000. Missing funds traced to Clara's accounts. The room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Clara's accounts. The family inheritance that bought the platinum watch, the designer suits, and the expensive home on Queen Anne Hill. It wasn't old money at all. It was blood money, skimmed straight off the top of Marcus Thorne's illegal smuggling operation right under the nose of the city's most dangerous mob boss, using Arthur's mathematical genius to keep the ledgers looking clean. Arthur hadn't just been a terrified victim caught in the crossfire. He was the architect of the theft. He had been stealing from Marcus Thorne, laundering the dirty cash through his own wife's bank accounts, and when Thorne finally figured out the balance didn't hold, the house of cards came crashing down. That explained why Arthur was running for his life. That explained why Mickey O'Bannon had confronted him at the Olympic Hotel with a red matchbook and a stern warning. And that explained why Ruby the waitress, who probably worked as a courier or a go-between for Thorne's operation, had ended up with 2 bullets in her chest down at the Blue Gardenia. She was supposed to take the fall, or maybe she had tried to blackmail the wrong person for a piece of the pie. Benny Rivas was just the convenient idiot standing in the wrong alley at the wrong time with the smoking gun conveniently placed in his coat pocket. I closed the ledger and tucked it securely inside the inner pocket of my trench coat, right next to Clara's retainer envelope. The pieces weren't just floating anymore. They were locking into a deadly, unyielding chain of events. Suddenly, a sharp metallic sound cut through the quiet interior of the garage. Clink. It was the sound of gravel shifting under the weight of a shoe, followed immediately by the heavy, muffled crunch of a boot stepping onto the flagstone path outside the service door. I froze, my hand dropping instinctively to the grip of my Smith & Wesson inside my coat pocket. I clicked off the penlight, plunging the garage back into absolute, suffocating darkness. Footsteps were approaching the side door. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The door handle rattled. Someone was trying to turn it. I stood up silently from the milk crate, pressing my back flat against the cold concrete wall beside the workbench, my heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The streets had talked, the garage had confessed, and whoever was standing on the other side of that door was about to find out that waiting in the dark for Harry Nile is a very dangerous way to start the morning. Chapter 5. The handle of the side service door rattled again, harder this time, as whoever was out there tested the latch. The metal mechanism groaned against the wood frame, a sharp, metallic squeak that hung heavily in the cold air of the garage. I kept my back flat against the concrete wall, my right hand firmly wrapped around the checkered grip of my Smith & Wesson inside the deep pocket of my trench coat. My thumb pressed against the cold steel of the hammer, ready to cock it at the first sign of movement. The footsteps outside paused. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, the only sound in the garage was the low, rhythmic ticking of my Plymouth's engine cooling down half a block away, and the frantic pounding of blood in my own ears. Then came the scrape of a shoe against the gravel path, followed by a low murmur of voices drifting around the corner of the building. "Check the back window," a rough voice muttered, low enough to be swallowed by the wind. "If he's stupid enough to hole up in here, we'll box him in." "The boss said make it clean," a second voice replied, closer to the door. "No noise if we can help it. The cops are already crawling all over the waterfront. We don't need to heat the hill." Heavy boots crunched away from the door, moving briskly along the flagstone path toward the rear of the garage. I let out a slow, silent breath through my nose. 2 of them. Probably Thorne's cleanup crew, sent to sweep up whatever Arthur had left behind, or maybe just checking to see if the private eye snooping around downtown had decided to extend his tour into the suburbs. I didn't wait for them to find a way. I slipped quietly across the concrete floor, keeping low beneath the line of the windows, and moved toward the dark recess behind the riding lawnmower. There was a small, high-set ventilation window near the back corner, held shut by a rusted latch. It was small, but if you didn't mind scraping a little skin off your knuckles, it was big enough to crawl through. I popped the latch with the blade of my pocket knife, pushed the hinged pane outward into the damp morning air, and hoisted myself up. I squeezed through head first, dropped clumsily onto the frosted grass of the backyard, and rolled over into the deep shadow of the evergreen hedge. A moment later, a muffled thud echoed from inside the garage as someone forced the side service door open. I didn't stick around to compare notes. I kept low against the frozen ground, scuttled past the edge of the colonial house, and sprinted down the driveway toward the asphalt street before the neighborhood could wake up and catch a guy in a trench coat playing hide-and-seek with the Seattle underworld. My Plymouth was sitting right where I left it, looking like a rusted-out metal coffin waiting for a customer. I threw open the driver's side door, slid behind the wheel, and cranked the ignition. The old engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught with a rich, dark cloud of exhaust that smelled wonderfully like safety. I threw it into gear, pulled away from the curb without turning on my headlights until I rounded the corner and pointed the nose of the car back down toward the flatlands. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my brain was racing faster than a streetcar running downhill with bad brakes. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy leather-bound audit ledger I had liberated from Arthur's strongbox. Under the faint amber glow of the dashboard lights, I flipped it open to the pages I had skimmed earlier. The columns of red ink stared back at me, a silent confession written in precise, immaculate handwriting. Arthur Belmont hadn't just been skimming Marcus Thorne's smuggling profits. He had been documenting every single transaction with the meticulous eye of a man building an insurance policy. A $40,000 shortfall traced directly to Clara's bank accounts. But as I stared at the numbers, tracking the dates and the deposit slips listed in the margins, a jagged piece of the puzzle didn't fit. Something was wrong with the timeline. According to Clara's frantic story, Arthur had vanished on Monday afternoon right after a lunch meeting at the Olympic Hotel, dodging a bullet, running for his life, and leaving his bloody shirt behind in the garage before disappearing into the rainy night. But as I flipped back through the audit ledger, comparing the dates of the final wire transfers to the shipping manifest recorded in the back of the book, the math flat out refused to balance. The last major cash transfer from Thorne's illicit freight routing, the exact $40,000 chunk that triggered the audit discrepancy, hadn't cleared on Monday, as Clara claimed. It had cleared on Friday afternoon, 3 full days before Arthur allegedly shot and hid. If Arthur had known about the missing money on Friday, and if Mickey O'Bannon had tracked him down at the Olympic Hotel to deliver a red matchbook and a warning, why did Arthur wait until Monday night to make his move? Why spend an entire weekend sitting at home on Queen Anne Hill, mowing the lawn, listening to baseball games, and acting like a mild-mannered bookkeeper, only to suddenly panic and run when the trap was already sprung? People don't wait 48 hours to run for their lives when hitmen with missing pinkies are breathing down their necks. Unless, of course, they weren't running. Unless they were setting up a detour. I killed the headlights as I pulled into a deserted diner parking lot down on Stewart Street, letting the car coast into a dark spot near a rusted-out dumpster. The rain had started up again, a fine, stinging mist that coated the windshield in a gray film. I pulled out my notepad and a stub of a pencil, clicking on the overhead dome light. I needed to rebuild the weekend, hour by hour, alibi by alibi. I started with Friday, the day the money cleared. According to the ledger notes, Friday was the day Arthur had signed off on the fraudulent shipping manifests for a bulk shipment of contraband electronics coming off a freighter from Yokohama. He had cleared the manifest at the Pacific Consolidated Dock Office at 2 p.m. Where was Clara on Friday afternoon? I flipped to her first statement in my head. She had claimed she spent the weekend at home, waiting for Arthur to come back from work. But when I visited the garage earlier, I had noticed something else tucked away behind the workbench, a dry cleaning receipt from a high-end boutique down in downtown Seattle, dated Friday evening, alongside a parking garage stub stamped 6:30 p.m. An expensive boutique downtown on a Friday night isn't where a terrified wife stays hidden while her husband embezzles mob money. That's where a woman goes to buy a new dress to celebrate a successful payout. I tapped the pencil against the steering wheel, the wooden click sounding sharp in the quiet car. Let's look at Sunday, the day before the disappearance. Arthur's phone logs, which I had briefly glanced at in the second drawer of his workbench before popping the strongbox, showed an outgoing call made from his home landline at 8 p.m. on Sunday evening. The number called wasn't registered to Pacific Consolidated Freight. It wasn't registered to Marcus Thorne. It was registered to a small private airstrip near Renton, a local charter aviation service specializing in unregistered night flights up toward the British Columbia border. A charter flight to Canada. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together with a violent jarring click, like a set of steel handcuffs locking around a suspect's wrists. Arthur had not been ambushed Monday night. He hadn't been frantically running for his life from hitmen while dodging bullets in a dark alley. He was engineering an exit strategy. The bloody shirt, The frantic phone call to his wife. The supposed ambush behind the freight yards. It was all a staged performance. A brilliant calculated smokescreen designed to make everyone, Marcus Thorne, the Seattle Police Department, and his own aristocratic wife, believe that Arthur Belmont was a dead man, a terrified victim wiped out by the mob. While the underworld looked for a dead bookkeeper, a very much alive Arthur Belmont would be boarding a charter plane out of Renton with 40 grand in laundered cash, flying north to start a brand new life where nobody asked questions about missing shipping manifests. It was a masterpiece of corporate deceit. There was only one fatal flaw in Arthur's grand design. He had forgotten to explain his wife. Clara hadn't been an innocent bystander waiting anxiously on Queen Anne Hill for her husband to call. She was his partner in crime. The family inheritance wasn't old money. It was the siphon he had built into Thorne's accounts, channeled directly into her private holdings. She knew about the money, she knew about the escape plan, and she had hired me, a cheap, gullible private investigator, not to find a missing husband, but to establish a bulletproof, publicly verified paper trail that would lead the police right to the conclusion that Arthur was a victim of mob violence. Once the cops closed the file on a dead bookkeeper, Clara would be free to sit on her Queen Anne estate, enjoy the stolen fortune, and file an insurance claim on a husband who conveniently vanished into thin air. I let out a low whistle, shaking my head in grudging admiration. It was a cold, heartless scheme, cooked up by a couple of people who looked like suburban royalty, but possessed the moral compass of a dockside pirate. Which brought me back to the bloody shirt sitting on my office desk. If Arthur hadn't been shot in an alley behind the freight yard on Monday night, where did the blood come from? And whose blood was it? A man doesn't splash real, dried human blood onto a white dress shirt just for dramatic flair, unless he had access to a medical supply house, or unless someone really had been bleeding. I thought of the waitress at the Blue Gardenia, Ruby Masters. Ruby had been shot twice in the chest on Monday night, right around the time Clara claimed Arthur was making his frantic, terrified phone call from hiding. Ruby had been packing a bag, telling Benny Rivas she had just come into some money, a big payout from a pencil-pushing square she'd been doing favors for. Arthur hadn't just been using Clara to launder money. He had been using Ruby as a local courier, moving cash and carrying messages between the dock workers and the front office. And when Ruby figured out how much was actually moving through the pipeline, or when she tried to cut herself a larger slice of the pie to keep her mouth shut, someone decided she knew too much. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Arthur didn't flee because Thorne's men caught him. Arthur fled because he had to silence the courier before she could sing to the mob, and in the process, he staged his own murder to keep Thorne and the cops off his back permanently. It was a clean, beautiful trap, except for one small detail that was currently itching at the back of my neck like a stray tag on a cheap wool suit. If Arthur was the one who pulled the trigger on Ruby to secure his escape, why did Mickey O'Bannon and Thorne's cleanup crew seem so genuinely surprised when the body dropped? And why did they frame Benny Rivas so quickly? Because Thorne's mob didn't kill Ruby, and Arthur didn't kill her either. Someone else wanted Ruby dead just as badly as Arthur wanted to disappear. Someone who was playing a completely different game on the Seattle waterfront. I checked my watch. 5:20 a.m. The sky overhead was beginning to turn a sickly, bruised shade of gray, pushing back the dark against the stubborn drizzle. I fired up the Plymouth's engine, dropped it into gear, and pulled out of the diner parking lot. The trail was getting crowded. Everyone from the mob bosses to suburban bookkeepers and scheming wives were running hard to get to the finish line first. I needed to see Clara Belmont again, not as a hired private eye taking her retainer envelope, but as the guy who just opened her husband's strongbox and found the ledger that proved she was sitting on 40,000 stolen mob dollars. I pointed the car back up toward Queen Anne Hill. The timeline didn't hold. The alibis were cracking like thin river ice, and the final showdown was coming down the pike a lot faster than anyone expected. It was time to find out just how good Clara really was at playing the grieving widow when the script started falling apart at the seams. Chapter 6. The rain had settled into a steady, spiteful drizzle by the time I pointed the Plymouth back up the steep, winding grades of Queen Anne Hill. The neighborhood looked completely different in the early morning gray than it had under the cover of midnight. The manicured lawns were slick with a cold, glassy frost, and the stately colonial houses sat behind their wrought iron fences like sleeping judges, hiding all kinds of dirty little secrets behind leaded glass windows and polished oak front doors. I parked half a block down from number 412, cutting the engine and letting the radiator ping softly in the damp chill. I didn't bother turning off the headlights. I just sat there for a minute, watching the windshield wipers sweep back and forth in a metronomic rhythm that matched the steady thrum of my own thoughts. The heavy, leather-bound audit ledger sat on the passenger seat beside me, its peeling gold leaf lettering catching the faint amber glow of the dashboard. Inside those pages lay the blueprint of a multi-layered con that made the usual nickel-and-dime grifts down on the waterfront look like a game of checkers. Arthur Belmont wasn't just a nervous pencil pusher who happened to stumble into a hornet's nest. He was the architect. He had engineered a brilliant, cold-blooded siphon right out of Marcus Thorne's illegal shipping empire, funneling $40,000 of dirty mob money directly into his wife's private accounts. And Clara? Clara wasn't the grieving, terrified housewife she had pretended to be when she walked into my office yesterday morning with an expensive leather handbag and a $500 retainer. She was in the vault. She was the silent, elegant partner who wore platinum watches studded with sapphires and smiled politely at garden parties while living off stolen blood money. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, but there was still a jagged edge that refused to sit flush. If Arthur and Clara were in on the grift together, if they had planned the ultimate exit strategy to bleed the mob dry and catch a charter flight north to Canada, why had Arthur staged a violent, bloody escape that made him look like a hunted animal? Why leave behind a bloody shirt in the garage and send his wife running to a private eye with a fabricated story? Because couples who steal 40 grand together don't always trust each other when the wolves start scratching at the back door. When things got hot, Arthur hadn't planned on sharing the escape hatch. He had planned on cutting Clara loose, taking the lion's share of the cash, and disappearing into the Canadian wilderness alone, leaving his aristocratic wife to face the music when Marcus Thorne's enforcers came looking for their missing ledger. That was the real secret life. Not just the stolen money, but the double cross within the double cross. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a Chesterfield, and lit it with my Zippo, filling the small, confined space of the car with blue smoke. I needed to see Clara again before the morning paper hit the driveways. I needed to lay the ledger out on her polished mahogany dining table and watch her elegant icy veneer crack right down the middle. I opened the car door, stepped out into the freezing drizzle, and pulled the collar of my trench coat tight around my neck. The walk down the sidewalk was quiet, my leather soles crunching softly against the frozen crust on the grass. When I reached number 412, I didn't bother with the front walkway or the polite brass doorbell. I slipped down the side yard, moving past the frozen evergreen bushes toward the back patio. The house was completely dark, save for that same dim amber lamp burning in the upstairs bedroom window. I climbed the back steps, slid my hand into my coat pocket to check the comforting heavy weight of my Smith & Wesson, and reached for the back door handle. I expected it to be locked. After all, a woman whose husband was supposedly dodging bullets from mob hitmen would likely bolt every deadbolt in the house. But my fingers barely brushed the brass knob when the latch gave way with a soft, effortless click. The door swung inward, revealing a dark, silent kitchen that smelled faintly of stale coffee and expensive perfume. I stepped inside, letting the door close gently behind me. The floorboards beneath my shoes didn't even creak. I drew the revolver from my pocket, holding it down low by my right thigh, and moved stealthily through the pantry into the spacious, high-ceilinged dining room. The house was wrapped in an eerie, tomb-like stillness. No radio playing baseball games, no ticking clocks, no sound at all except for the faint, steady patter of rain against the tall sash windows. That was when I smelled it. It wasn't the sweet, cloying gardenia perfume that Clara had worn yesterday, or the heavy scent of jasmine she used to mask her nerves. It was a sharp, metallic tang that cut right through the clean, upper-class atmosphere of the room like a rusty razor. Blood. My grip tightened on the revolver's grip. I moved toward the grand staircase that curved upward into the shadows of the second floor, each step deliberate and measured. The amber lamp I had seen from the street was upstairs, casting a long, slanted beam of yellow light across the upper landing. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw that the bedroom door was standing wide open. I stepped to the threshold and looked inside. The last remaining illusion about the Belmont household evaporated into thin air. The bedroom was a disaster area. Drawers had been yanked out of their dressers, their contents, silk blouses, expensive undergarments, and fine linens, spilled across the Aubusson rug like drifted snow. The mattress had been slashed open, white stuffing leaking out like cotton guts. Someone had been searching the room, and they hadn't been particularly polite about it, and sprawled on the floor beside the overturned vanity table was Clara Belmont. She wasn't wearing her elegant dark wool suit or her Italian leather shoes anymore. She was wearing a silk bathrobe embroidered with silver thread, now soaked dark around the waist with a spreading stain of crimson. Her dark hair, usually fixed in a harsh aristocratic style, was loose and tangled across the floorboards. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly up at the plaster ceiling with an expression of profound, unadulterated shock. She was dead, and judging by the temperature of the room and the sluggish consistency of the pool beneath her, she hadn't been gone very long, maybe an hour, maybe less. I stepped cautiously into the room, keeping my gun raised, my eyes scanning the corners for any uninvited guests who might still be hanging around to admire their handiwork. The room was empty. Just me, the overturned furniture, and a dead woman who had tried to play a high-stakes game with $40,000 of mob money and lost. I holstered my revolver, stepped around the spreading pool of blood, and knelt beside her. The platinum watch studded with sapphires was still strapped to her slender wrist, ticking away merrily as if nothing had happened. Thorne's enforcers weren't jewel thieves. They didn't care about the accessories. They cared about the ledger. They cared about the missing money. And someone had found what they were looking for. Or worse, someone hadn't found it, and they had taken it out of Clara's hide before clearing out through the back door. I stood up, shaking my head slowly. The case was spinning out of control, shedding bodies like a runaway freight car shedding sparks on a downhill grade. First Ruby down at the Blue Gardenia, and now Clara right here in her own upscale bedroom on Queen Anne Hill. The body count was rising, and the local precinct was still patting themselves on the back for slapping the cuffs on Benny Rivas down in a dark alley. If Loomis and his boys saw this, they'd probably try to pin Clara's murder on Benny too, claiming he broke out of jail just to settle an old score. That's how lazy departments work when they want a clean ledger of their own. I approached the shattered vanity table. Amidst the spilled bottles of expensive French perfume and broken compact mirrors, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper, torn from a notepad, was pinned beneath a silver hairbrush. I pulled it out and held it up to the amber light of the bedside lamp. Scrawled across the paper in a hurried, nervous handwriting, not Clara's neat cursive, but a jagged masculine scrawl, was a single address and a time: the Grand Central Pier, slip 4, 6 a.m., 6 a.m. I checked my wristwatch. It was 5:45 a.m. 15 minutes from right now. The Grand Central Pier was down on the downtown waterfront, right in the shadow of the massive shipping cranes operated by Pacific Consolidated Freight. It was where the big freighters tied up to unload their cargo under the cover of the morning fog and the Seattle drizzle. Arthur wasn't dead. He hadn't fled to Canada yet, or maybe he was just now making his final move, meeting the person who had financed his escape, or the person who was coming to collect the final payment. Whoever had written that note had left it behind in a hurry, or perhaps Clara had managed to scribble it down while her killer was tearing the room apart. Either way, it was a live grenade with the pin pulled out, and it was ticking down the seconds on the dock. I didn't waste another second. I turned away from Clara's body, walked quickly out of the bedroom, and descended the stairs. I crossed the dark kitchen and slipped out through the back door into the cold, wet morning air, letting the heavy wood slam shut behind me. My breath plumed white in front of me as I broke into a run down the flagstone path toward where I had left the Plymouth parked down the block. The engine was still ticking slightly as I jumped behind the steering wheel, slammed the door, and cranked the ignition. The old Flathead 6 roared to life, coughing a cloud of gray exhaust into the wet street. I threw the shifter into reverse, spun the wheel hard, and rocketed away from the curb without turning on my lights until I hit the bottom of the hill. The rain was coming down harder now, a cold, driving downpour that turned the asphalt into a black mirror reflecting the smeary neon signs of downtown Seattle. The clock on the dashboard clicked forward. 5:50 a.m. 10 minutes to cover 3 miles of slick, treacherous city streets. My mind raced as I navigated the deserted avenues, weaving around parked delivery trucks and sliding slightly through a yellow light at 4th and Pike. If Arthur was heading down to Slip 4 at the Grand Central Pier by 6 o'clock, he was walking into a slaughterhouse. Marcus Thorne didn't leave loose ends, and a bookkeeper who had stolen 40 grand and set up a double cross wasn't going to be offered a retirement package and a gold watch. And if Clara's killer was heading down there to intercept him, or if Arthur himself had come back to tie up the final loose end with his wife before heading out to sea, then the final showdown was shaping up to be a very messy, very public family reunion. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, feeling the Plymouth's rear tires slip momentarily on the wet car tracks before catching traction and surging forward. The waterfront was looming ahead, a dark, jagged maze of massive brick warehouses, iron cranes, and the heavy sulfurous smell of salt water and diesel fuel. The case was down to its final minutes. The streets had talked, the garage had confessed, the strongbox had given up its ghosts, and 2 bodies were already growing cold in the Seattle rain. It was time to find Slip 4, step out of the shadows, and see how a hard-boiled noir story handles a man who tries to outsmart the tide. Chapter 7. The rain was coming down in thick, wind-driven sheets by the time I cut the Plymouth's engine 100 yards short of the Grand Central Pier. I killed the headlights and let the car coast to a silent stop beside a rusted-out steel dumpster that smelled of rotting fish and wet cardboard. The waterfront at 6 in the morning on a freezing Saturday was about as welcoming as a firing squad. The massive gantry cranes of Pacific Consolidated Freight loomed out of the swirling gray fog like giant skeletal spiders, their iron cables clanking mournfully against the structural beams in the gusting wind from Elliott Bay. I reached inside my trench coat, my fingers wrapping around the checkered grip of my Smith & Wesson. I pulled the revolver out, checked the cylinder with a quick, practiced flick of my wrist and clicked it back into place before sliding it back into my pocket. My knuckles were cold, stiffened by the biting maritime chill, but my head was clear. The note I had found pinned under Clara's silver hairbrush on Queen Anne Hill, the Grand Central Pier, Slip 4, 6 o'clock a.m., wasn't just a clue anymore. It was a countdown. I checked the dash clock, 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes to spare. I popped the car door open, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and pulled the brim of my fedora low to keep the water out of my eyes. I kept to the deep, impenetrable shadows cast by the towering brick warehouse walls, moving with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent too many years walking alleys where the streetlights didn't work and the cops didn't ask questions. Slip 4 was located at the far northern end of the pier, tucked away behind a row of corrugated tin shipping sheds where the water ran deep enough to accommodate the heavy coastal freighters. As I drew closer, the ambient roar of the surf and the howling wind began to mix with a sound that didn't belong to the weather. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of a heavy marine diesel engine idling at half throttle. A sleek, gray-hulled wooden yacht was tied off to the pilings at Slip 4. Its brass fixtures gleamed faintly through the gray mist, and a pale yellow light glowed warmly from the windows of its small pilot house. It wasn't a standard commercial tug or a working cargo barge. It was a luxury cruiser, the kind of boat owned by men who made very large amounts of money and didn't care who they stepped on to keep it rolling. Men like Marcus Thorne, or men like Arthur Belmont, who had spent the last 3 years skimming $40,000 right out from under Thorne's aristocratic nose. I crept up behind a massive wooden crate stenciled with Pacific Consolidated Freight, Yokohama, using its bulk as a shield. From my vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the wooden gangplank leading down from the pier to the deck of the yacht. A man was standing on the aft deck, pacing back and forth with frantic, jerky movements. He was wearing a rumpled, cheap wool suit that looked soaked through by the rain, and his thinning hair was plastered flat against his skull. He kept pulling out a silver pocket watch, snapping it open, staring at the dial for a fraction of a second, and snapping it shut again with an impatient click. Arthur Belmont. He didn't look like a mild-mannered bookkeeper who liked crossword puzzles and went to bed by 10 o'clock. He looked like a cornered animal waiting for a hunter who was running late. His shoulders were hunched, his hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and every time the diesel engine coughed or a cable creaked overhead, he flinched as if someone had fired a pistol right next to his ear. So Arthur hadn't fled to Canada yet. He was waiting for his ride. Or maybe he was waiting for the person who had financed his escape in the first place. The person who had promised him a clean break once the ledger was balanced and the 40 grand was safely tucked away offshore. I rested my hand on my gun, preparing to step out from behind the crate and ask Arthur a few pointed questions about his wife's untimely demise up on Queen Anne Hill, when a heavy rhythmic crunch of footsteps echoed over the wooden planks of the pier behind me. I froze, melting back into the deep shadow of the cargo crate, holding my breath. A figure emerged from the swirling fog, walking with a slow, deliberate, unhurried stride. The man was built like a brick retaining wall, wearing a heavy trench coat with the collar turned up high against the storm. As he stepped under the amber glow of the pier's single working overhead light, I caught sight of his face. It was a broad, flat face with a smashed cauliflower ear on the left side. And as he reached down to pull a heavy black leather cigarette case from his coat pocket, the light caught his left hand. The top half of his left pinky finger was cleanly missing. Mickey the Mute O'Bannon, Marcus Thorne's personal shadow, his primary enforcer, and the man Eddie had seen whispering threats to Arthur across the mahogany bar of the Olympic Hotel days ago. Mickey didn't run. He didn't need to. Men who carry big guns and respond directly to mob bosses don't have to jog. He walked down the wooden pier with the crushing, inevitable momentum of an incoming tide. Arthur stopped pacing the deck of the yacht the moment he heard the boots on the wood. He spun around, his face going chalk white, the color draining out of him until he looked like a corpse standing in the rain. "Mickey," Arthur croaked, his voice cracking loudly enough to carry across the narrow gap of water. You said you'd have the papers ready. You said the charter boat was set for 6 o'clock. Mickey O'Bannon paused at the top of the gangplank, looking down at the frantic bookkeeper with an expression of profound, chilling indifference. He didn't pull a gun immediately. He just slowly flipped open his leather cigarette case, pulled out a cigarette, and stuck it between his lips. "The boat's ready, Artie," Mickey said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the sound of the diesel engine. "And the papers are in the cabin. Everything you need to start a brand new life in South America, or Canada, wherever it is. Bookkeepers go when they retire early." Arthur let out a shaky, desperate breath, sagging slightly against the brass railing of the yacht. "Then let's go. Let's get moving. The cops are crawling all over the waterfront, and Clara's taken care of," Mickey interrupted smoothly, striking a match with his thumbnail and shielding the tiny flame against the wind. He lit his cigarette, took a long drag, and blew a thick cloud of blue smoke into the damp air. "We visited her house about an hour ago. Lovely place, great view of the lake." Arthur stiffened, his eyes widening in sudden, unmitigated horror. You went to the house? You said you weren't going to touch her. You said she was part of the deal." "Deals change, Artie," Mickey said, stepping down the gangplank onto the deck of the yacht, closing the distance between them with slow, measured steps. "When you skim 40 grand from a man like Marcus Thorne, you don't get to keep an active partner on the outside. Thorne doesn't like loose ends, and a woman who knows where every dirty dime is buried isn't a partner, Artie. She's a liability. She was my wife." Arthur screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical pitch that finally shattered the quiet of the pier. "We planned this together. She helped me set up the shell accounts." "Yeah, she helped you," Mickey agreed calmly, taking another drag of his cigarette. "And she did a fine job, until she started demanding a bigger cut of the pie. She called us yesterday afternoon, Artie. Tried to blackmail Thorne for an extra 20 grand to keep her mouth shut about your little escape plan. She figured since you were planning to cut her loose and run north alone, she might as well cash out twice." I stood behind my wooden crate, the pieces of the puzzle violently rearranging themselves in my skull with the force of a wrecking ball. Clara hadn't been an innocent victim of a mob hit. She hadn't been the terrified, loyal wife sitting on Queen Anne Hill waiting for her husband to call. She had been playing a double cross of her own, trying to squeeze Marcus Thorne for extra cash behind Arthur's back, using the ledger as leverage. And when Thorne found out, he didn't send a hitman to stage a gentle warning. He sent the cleanup crew to silence her permanently. Which brought me back to a very small, very stubborn detail that had been nagging at the back of my mind ever since I walked into the bloody bedroom on Queen Anne Hill. A detail that wouldn't die. When I knelt beside Clara's body in her silk bathrobe, staring at the pool of crimson on the floorboards, I noticed something odd about the way the room was torn apart. Drawers had been yanked out, mattresses slashed, vanity tables smashed. It looked like a frantic, desperate search for the missing audit ledger. But Mickey O'Bannon and Thorne's crew were professionals, cold, calculated executioners who knew exactly what they were looking for. They wouldn't trash a bedroom like a couple of amateur burglars looking for loose silver unless they were hunting for something specific, and they hadn't found it, because I had already taken it out of Arthur's strongbox in the garage hours earlier. If Mickey and his boys had ransacked the house looking for the ledger and come up empty-handed, why did they kill Clara? Because she refused to tell them where it was hidden. She went to her grave protecting the one piece of leverage she had left, thinking she could outsmart the mob right down to the final breath. Arthur backed away from Mickey until his spine hit the yacht's cabin door. His face was twisted in sheer, unadulterated terror. He realized now, too late, that the trap he had built to catch everyone else had finally sprung shut on his own neck. "You're going to kill me," Arthur whispered, his knees trembling so hard his trousers shook. "Even after I gave you the routing codes, even after I made the books look clean." "Ah, especially after that, Artie," Mickey said softly, tossing his cigarette butt overboard into the dark water of the slip, where it hissed and died instantly. He reached inside his heavy trench coat and pulled out a snub-nosed .38 revolver, its matte blue steel barrel catching the pale light from the pilot house. "Thorne sends his regards," he said. "Tell the bookkeeper the balance finally balances." Mickey raised the barrel, lining it up dead center with Arthur's chest. I couldn't wait any longer. If I let Mickey pull the trigger, the only thing left to investigate would be a morgue report and another closed file on Frank Loomis's desk. I stepped out from behind the massive cargo crate, my hand clearing the pocket of my trench coat with the Smith & Wesson leveled at the center of Mickey's massive back. "Drop the piece, Mickey," I called out, my voice cutting through the hiss of the rain and the thrum of the diesel engine like a butcher's knife. "The math doesn't work out on this one." Mickey froze. He didn't drop the gun, but he stopped his forward momentum, his arm hanging half raised. He slowly turned his head over his shoulder, his cold, pale eyes locking onto mine with an expression that combined mild annoyance with deep, professional disgust. "Harry Nile," Mickey muttered, a humorless smirk touching the corner of his battered mouth. "I heard you were sniffing around the docks like a stray mutt. Looks like you finally found a bone too big to chew." "Maybe," I said, taking 2 slow steps down the pier toward the gangplank, keeping my revolver locked dead on his spine. "But I've got a bad habit of finishing the paperwork before I punch out. Put the iron down, Mickey. The cops are already halfway down Alaskan Way, and even Marcus Thorne can't buy his way out of 2 double homicides in 24 hours. Mickey let out a low, gravelly chuckle. He lowered the barrel of his gun just an inch, but he didn't drop it. "You think the cops are coming for me, Harry? You think Loomis and his boys are going to roll up here and arrest Marcus Thorne's top guy over a couple of dead grifters? Loomis is a pain in the ass, but he's still wearing a badge," I said, stepping onto the wooden gangplank. The wet wood groaned slightly under my weight, and I've got a heavy leather ledger sitting right here in my inside coat pocket that proves Thorne's entire shipping empire is built on a mountain of forged manifests and stolen cash. Once that hits the district attorney's desk, not even Thorne's judges can sweep it under the rug. Mickey's eyes flicked down to my coat pocket, where the outline of the ledger pressed against the fabric. A dangerous, calculating light flickered in his gaze. He realized the game had changed. Patsy was no longer Benny Rivas. The Patsy was standing right here on the deck of a luxury yacht, holding a smoking gun and running out of time. "You're a persistent bastard, Harry," Mickey said smoothly, his grip tightening on his revolver as his body began to pivot slowly toward me. "I'll give you that." "Thanks," I said, tightening my finger on the trigger. "My mother always said I had a hard head. The details that wouldn't die, the matchbook, the missing pinky, the fraudulent shipping manifests, and the dead waitress at the Blue Gardenia had finally woven themselves into a tight, inescapable noose. The setup was complete. The unmasking was happening in real time on a wet Seattle pier, and the only thing left to decide was whether I was going to walk away with a dry coat or end up sleeping with the fishes alongside Arthur Belmont's grand design. Chapter 8. The rain was coming down hard enough to wash the sins right off the Seattle waterfront, or at least try its damnedest. On the wet wood of the Grand Central Pier, the wind whipped off Elliott Bay like a cold razor, carrying the heavy sulfurous stench of diesel, rotting kelp, and damp salt. The diesel engine of the luxury cruiser hummed a low, concussive vibration right through the soles of my shoes, a steady mechanical heartbeat that seemed to count down the seconds we had left before everything went sideways. Mickey the Mute O'Bannon stood 6 paces away, his massive shoulders swallowed by the gloom of his heavy trench coat, the brim of his fedora casting a deep shadow over his flat, battered face. His left hand, missing the top half of the pinky finger, rested casually near the snub-nosed .38 tucked inside his coat. He wasn't sweating. Guys like Mickey don't sweat, they just leak grease and bad intentions. Behind him, pressed flat against the mahogany bulkhead of the pilot house, Arthur Belmont looked like a man who had already seen his own tombstone and didn't care much for the engraving. The frantic, manic energy that had driven him to steal 40 grand from Marcus Thorne and engineer an elaborate, bloody disappearance had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a human being. "You're holding a dead hand, Harry," Mickey said, his voice a low gravel grate that barely cut through the sound of the surf slapping against the pilings. "You walk away with your skin, you keep your license, you go back to counting ceiling cracks in Pioneer Square. You try to play hero on a wet pier at 6 in the morning, and the tide's going to carry you out past Bainbridge Island before breakfast." "I'm not much of a card player, Mickey," I said, keeping my Smith on level, my eye fixed squarely on the center mass of his chest. "And I've never been big on walking away before the final act, especially when the house is cheating." "The house always cheats, Harry," Mickey replied, a slow, ugly smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "That's why it's called the house." He didn't drop his gun. Instead, his weight shifted slightly onto his back foot, his massive shoulders coiling like a steel spring. He was calculating the distance, measuring the split-second window it would take to clear his holster before my lead found his ribs. It was the stance of a guy who had settled plenty of arguments in dark alleys behind the docks, and he didn't expect a third-floor private eye from Pioneer Square to upset the odds. I didn't give him the chance to finish the math. Instead of stepping forward, I flicked my wrist and threw my weight to the left, diving behind a heavy, steel-reinforced mooring bit bolted directly to the wooden planks of the pier. Crack! The heavy report of Mickey's .38 shattered the damp morning quiet like a dropped plate of glass. A jagged splinter of aged Douglas fir exploded off the top of the mooring bit right beside my ear, showering my cheek with fine, stinging wood shards. I didn't hesitate. From my crouched position behind the iron bollard, I squeezed the trigger of my Smith & Wesson twice. The first round went wide, chewing a hole through the thin wooden railing of the yacht's upper deck. The second round found its mark. It didn't hit Mickey. It hit the heavy bronze housing of the ship's running light, mounted just behind his right shoulder. The brass shattered with a sharp, metallic ping, showering a spark of short-circuiting electrical current across the deck. Mickey cursed, stumbling half a step backward as the sudden shower of sparks blinded him for a crucial fraction of a second. That was all the opening I needed. I scrambled up from behind the mooring bit, crossed the narrow gap of the wooden gangplank in 3 lunging strides, and vaulted onto the deck of the cruiser, bringing my revolver up dead center on Mickey's chest. "Drop it, Mickey," I yelled, the rain plastering my trench coat to my back. "Drop the piece or I'll punch a hole right through your lung." Mickey froze. He stood there for 3 long, agonizing seconds, his hand hovering over the grip of his gun, his chest heaving under the heavy wool of his coat. He looked down at the shattered running light, then back up at my eyes. He saw the look in them, the stubborn, tired anger of a guy who was completely out of patience and entirely done with being pushed around by men who thought money and muscle bought them immunity from the laws of gravity. Slowly, deliberately, Mickey uncurled his fingers. He let the snub-nosed .38 slip from his grip. It hit the wet teak deck with a dull, heavy thud that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the storm. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, Nile," Mickey spat, raising his hands slowly to shoulder height, his face dark with suppressed rage. "I get that a lot," I said, keeping the barrel steady while I reached out with my left hand, grabbed the lapel of his trench coat, and shoved him hard against the bulkhead of the pilot house. He hit the wood with a solid, meaty thunk. "Now don't move an inch, or I'll let you see what a .45 feels like in .22 caliber dimensions." I turned my gaze away from Mickey for a split second to check on our host. Arthur Belmont was still pressed against the opposite wall of the cabin, sliding slowly down until he sat in a pathetic, trembling heap on the deck, his hands buried in his hair, whimpering like a whipped dog. "Get up, Arthur," I ordered sharply. Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot, wild and utterly vacant. She's dead," he stammered, his teeth chattering from the cold and the terror. Mickey said, "They went to the house. They killed Clara." "Yeah, they killed Clara," I said coldly, stepping closer to him while keeping my gun trained on Mickey out of the corner of my eye. And she would have done the exact same thing to you if she'd beaten you to the boat. You made a nice little team, Arthur. Too bad you both forgot that people who steal 40 grand from Marcus Thorne don't get to retire to a villa in South America. They get a shallow grave in the tide flats. Arthur opened his mouth to say something, maybe a defense, maybe a plea, maybe another lie, when the heavy rhythmic thrumming of a siren cut sharply through the damp air of the waterfront. It wasn't a single patrol car. It sounded like half the precinct was rolling down Alaskan Way, with their red lights spinning a frantic, bloody pattern across the gray fog and the brick facades of the warehouses. Mickey's mouth twitched into a cold, ugly smile. He knew the sound. Sounds like your friends are finally showing up for the party, Harry. Too bad they're about 5 minutes too late to save the show. They're right on time, Mickey, a gravelly voice boomed from the head of the pier. We all spun around. Standing at the top of the gangplank, half framed by the swirling mist and the flashing red lights of 2 police cruisers parked haphazardly on the asphalt, was Detective Sergeant Frank Loomis. He had his heavy trench coat buttoned to the chin, an unlit cigar jammed firmly in the corner of his mouth, and a snub-nosed police special held loosely in his right hand. He looked at the scene on the deck, Mickey pinned against the bulkhead, Arthur sobbing on the teakwood, and me standing over them with a smoking revolver, and let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded like a tire losing its last 30 pounds of pressure. I told you to stay away from the Pacific Consolidated Nile, Loomis growled, stepping down the gangplank with slow, heavy strides, his boots splashing through the puddles on the deck. I told you to leave the waterfront alone. You did, Frank, I agreed, lowering my pistol just an inch but keeping it ready. And if I had listened, I'd probably be sitting in a warm diner right now, eating cold toast instead of standing out here in the freezing rain cleaning up your department's mess. Loomis stopped a few feet away, casting a cold, appraising eye over Mickey O'Bannon. O'Bannon, fancy meeting you here. I thought you only hung out in high-end hotel bars and massage parlors. I was just taking a morning boat ride, Sergeant, Mickey said smoothly, his voice dropping back into its usual flat, unbothered register, enjoying the fresh air, until this private snoop jumped me and started waving a firearm around. Right, Loomis grunted, taking the cigar out of his mouth and pointing it at Mickey like a prosecutor's finger. And I suppose the dead girl down at the Blue Gardenia was just an accident, and the $40,000 missing from Thorne's ledgers is just a clerical error in the subtraction column. Mickey didn't blink. He knew the drill. Without a signed confession or a warrant signed by a judge who didn't play golf with Marcus Thorne, the department couldn't hold him for 48 hours without letting his high-priced corporate lawyers walk him right out the front doors of the precinct. I don't know anything about ledgers, Sergeant, Mickey said evenly, and my lawyer will be at the station by 8 o'clock to discuss my immediate release. Yeah, tell it to the judge, Loomis muttered, waving a hand at 2 uniformed cops who had just hurried down the pier behind him. Cuff this animal and read him his rights. Make sure you use the heavy steel ones. He's got a habit of slipping out of the cheap pairs. The 2 uniformed cops moved in fast, grabbing Mickey by the arms and slapping the cold steel cuffs around his wrists with practiced efficiency. Mickey didn't resist. He let them haul him up the gangplank, throwing one last long, chilling look over his shoulder at me as he disappeared into the flashing red glare of the patrol cars. Loomis watched him go, then turned his gaze down toward Arthur Belmont, who was still huddled in a shivering heap against the cabin wall. And what about the rabbit? Loomis asked, nodding his chin toward the bookkeeper. Is this the guy who was supposed to be hiding in an alley with a bullet in his shoulder? Check his left shoulder, Frank, I said, slipping my revolver back into the deep pocket of my trench coat and pulling out the heavy leather-bound audit ledger. I tossed it through the air. Loomis caught it deftly with one massive hand, looking down at the peeling gold leaf lettering with a sudden razor-sharp intensity. No bullet hole in the shirt, that was just part of the scene. But inside that book, you'll find every single forged manifest, every shell company, and every dollar of the $40,000 Arthur skimmed from Thorne's operation before his wife tried to double-cross the whole setup. Loomis flipped the ledger open, his thumb tracing the neat columns of red ink under the amber glow of the yacht's cabin lights. A slow, grim satisfaction spread across his granite-carved face. You found the books, Harry, Loomis murmured, looking up from the pages. The feds have been trying to get their hands on this ledger for 3 years. This isn't just a local embezzlement case anymore. This is a federal RICO package. Consider it my contribution to the municipal pension fund, I said, pulling out a crumpled pack of Chesterfields and shaking one loose. I tried to flick my Zippo, but the flint was damp from the rain and only produced a pathetic orange spark that died instantly in the wind. I cursed under my breath and shoved the unlit cigarette back into my pocket. Loomis snapped the ledger shut and tucked it securely under his arm. He looked around the deck of the luxury yacht, taking in the gray expanse of Elliott Bay, the skeletal cranes of the waterfront, and the miserable freezing rain falling all around us. "You know, Nile," Loomis said, his voice softening just a fraction, dropping the hard-boiled edge of the precinct house. "For a guy who operates out of a third-rate office with a broken lock and a pile of unpaid electric bills, you have a remarkable talent for making my job a whole hell of a lot more complicated." "I'm a public servant at heart, Frank," I said, wiping a streak of cold rainwater off my forehead with the back of my sleeve. "You should put me in for a Christmas bonus." "I'll put you in for a cell next to Benny Rivas if you don't get off this boat and go home," Loomis grunted, turning around to supervise the uniformed cops as they hauled a weeping, utterly broken Arthur Belmont up the gangplank toward the waiting patrol cars. The case was over. The books were balanced, the dead bodies were accounted for, and the mob's favorite enforcer was headed downtown to cool his heels while the district attorney figured out how to unwrap a $40,000 federal RICO indictment. I stood alone on the deck of the yacht for a minute, watching the red lights of the police cruisers fade away down Alaskan Way as they merged into the gray, indifferent morning traffic of the city. I turned my collar up against the driving rain, stepped off the boat, and began the long, cold walk back to where my battered Plymouth was parked beside the dumpster. The engine was cold now, dead silent, waiting for me to turn the key. Nothing was really fixed. Marcus Thorne was probably sitting in some high-rise office downtown right now, sipping imported coffee and hiring 3 new lawyers to replace the ones he lost. Clara and Ruby were still cold in their graves, and Arthur was trading his custom suits for a standard-issue prison jumpsuit. The streets of Seattle were just as wet, just as cynical, and just as full of desperate people trying to beat the house as they had been when the case first walked through my office door. I reached the Plymouth, climbed behind the steering wheel, and slammed the door shut against the storm. I pulled the unlit Chesterfield back out of my pocket, jammed it between my lips, and stared out through the rain-streaked windshield at the gray, sprawling expanse of the Pacific Northwest. Chapter 9. The basement interrogation room down at the municipal precinct smelled like 30 years of unwashed panic, floor wax that had long since given up, and the stale residue of 1,000 cigarettes smoked by guys who knew they were heading down the river. The walls were painted that institutional shade of green that makes you feel like you're being slowly digested inside the stomach of a very sick reptile. A single naked bulb hung from a frayed black cord over a scarred oak table, casting harsh, pitiless shadows across the room and making the bags under Detective Sergeant Frank Loomis's eyes look like 2 lead weights stitched into his face. Loomis wasn't sitting. He was pacing the length of the narrow room, his heavy overcoat still damp from the rain, his boots clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Every 3 steps he'd stop, glare down at the leather-bound audit ledger sitting dead center on the table, and then resume his march like a caged bulldog waiting for feeding time. I was sitting back in the wooden chair across from the table, my feet propped up on the edge, my trench coat still soaked through at the shoulders. I had a fresh, unlit Chesterfield parked squarely in the corner of my mouth, chewing on the filter because the matchbook I had lifted from Arthur's garage was still damp and the precinct desk sergeant had confiscated my Zippo at the front desk for evidence. The heavy steel door swung open with a loud metallic clang. Marcus Thorne walked in. He didn't look like a guy whose multi-million-dollar smuggling empire had just been cracked wide open by a third-rate private investigator from Pioneer Square. He looked like he was dropping by to review a real estate portfolio. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit that probably cost more than my Plymouth, a silk tie knotted with absolute precision, and a heavy cashmere overcoat draped casually over his shoulders. He didn't carry an umbrella, yet somehow not a single drop of Seattle rain had managed to mar the immaculate surface of his silver-streaked hair. Behind him stood his lawyer, a tall, skeletal man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a briefcase that looked like it had been carved out of an alligator's hide. Thorne didn't look at me. He didn't look at the scarred table. His pale, slate-gray eyes locked straight onto Frank Loomis, with the cold, unblinking focus of a shark cruising shallow water. "Sergeant Loomis," Thorne said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of heat. "My attorney informs me that you are holding one of my logistics managers under some remarkably imaginative pretexts, and that you've managed to accumulate a pile of stolen property from a private residence without a proper warrant. I'm here to clear up the misunderstanding before your department incurs a rather catastrophic series of civil liabilities." Loomis stopped pacing. He planted his massive hands flat on the wooden table, leaning forward until his face was 6 inches from Thorne's field of vision. The bulldog was ready to lock his jaws, and he didn't care about the lawyer's alligator briefcase. "You can skip the legal choreography, Thorne," Loomis growled, his voice sounding like gravel sliding down a galvanized pipe. "The party's over. We got the books, we got the shipping manifests, we got the wire transfer slips, and we got your #1 knuckle-dragger, Mickey O'Bannon, currently sitting 3 cells down screaming for a phone call he's not going to get." Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He slowly unbuttoned his cashmere coat, slid it off his shoulders, and handed it to his lawyer with the casual air of a man stepping out of his coat at an exclusive country club. "Mickey is a loyal employee who occasionally gets overzealous when local hoodlums try to hijack freight off our docks," Thorne said smoothly, finally letting his gaze drift lazily over toward me. A faint, aristocratic smirk touched the corner of his thin lips. "And as for books and manifests, paper is remarkably easy to forge, Sergeant, especially when desperate men trying to cover up their own embezzlement schemes manufacture it." "Embezzlement?" I pulled the Chesterfield out of my mouth, tossing it onto the table beside the ledger. "That's a cute word, Marcus. Sounds a lot cleaner than running a $40,000 siphon right out of your own slush fund while your bookkeeper played you for a sucker." Thorne's eyes flicked to me, narrowing just a fraction, the only physical tell he offered. "Ah, the freelance scavenger. I wondered whose footprint was dragging mud across my loading slips. You're out of your depth, Mr. Nile. You're playing with ledgers you don't understand, written by a dead man who spent his entire professional life hiding things from people smarter than you." "Arthur isn't dead yet, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice flat, conversational, and entirely unbothered by the 3-piece suit standing across from me. "Well, technically he's breathing. Though by the time the federal prosecutor finishes reviewing these columns, he's going to wish he had caught a bullet down at slip 4 instead of a federal holding cell." The skeletal lawyer leaned in toward Thorne, whispering something urgent in his ear. Thorne waved him back with a subtle flick of his hand, never taking his eyes off me. "You have nothing that links me to anything outside of legitimate interstate freight forwarding," Thorne said, his tone dropping an octave, turning cold and heavy. "The ledger is unauthenticated. The accounts listed in that book belong to shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands, entities that have no legal or financial connection to Pacific Consolidated Freight, to me, or to any enterprise I manage. You can wave that notebook in front of a grand jury until your arm falls off, Nile. The prosecutor won't even look at it without a signed chain of custody from a certified forensic accountant who can prove I touched the ink." Loomis's jaw clenched so hard I thought his back teeth were going to crack. He knew Thorne was right. That's how guys like Thorne survived in a city built on rain, graft, and wet concrete. They built walls out of paper corporations, insulated themselves behind layers of cutouts, and let the foot soldiers take the drop while the bosses sat in high-rise corner offices sipping scotch. The room went dead silent. The naked bulb hummed overhead, casting its harsh yellow glare across the ledger. Thorne looked victorious, his aristocratic veneer settling back over him like an expensive suit. He had won. The system was designed to protect men like him, and he knew how to play every gear in the machine, except he had forgotten one crucial detail. The detail that wouldn't die. I reached inside my coat pocket, bypassed the damp matchbook and my empty cigarette pack, and pulled out a small folded piece of heavy rag paper. It wasn't part of the ledger. It wasn't a bank deposit slip or a shipping manifest. It was a personal authorization memo, printed on official Pacific Consolidated Freight letterhead, bearing a unique corporate routing stamp in the bottom left-hand corner. I laid it out flat on the wooden table, right on top of the ledger, smoothing the creases out with the palm of my hand. Thorne glanced down at it. For the first time since he walked into the interrogation room, the color in his face didn't just shift, it drained completely, leaving his skin the color of wet newsprint. Recognize the letterhead, Marcus? I asked softly, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. Arthur was a meticulous guy. He didn't just keep books, he kept insurance. Every time you ordered him to route an unscheduled crate of contraband through Slip 4, you didn't just give him a verbal nod over a martini at the Olympic Hotel. You signed off on it, in ink, with your own personal corporate authorization code stamped right at the bottom, so the warehouse supervisors wouldn't ask awkward questions. Thorne's lawyer snatched the paper off the table, his eyes scanning the lines with frantic, skeletal speed. The lawyer's face went slack. He looked up at Thorne, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. That's not just an unauthenticated ledger, I continued, my voice carrying the steady, rhythmic cadence of a slow-moving freight train. That memo links the Cayman accounts directly to your personal corporate signature. It proves you ordered the shipments. It proves you knew about the discrepancies. And most importantly, it proves that when Arthur started siphoning off the top to fund his escape with Clara, he wasn't just stealing from a faceless holding company. He was stealing directly from you, and you used Mickey O'Bannon and a pair of .38 slugs to try and recover the assets before the feds found out. Loomis let out a short, sharp bark of laughter, a harsh, triumphant sound that echoed off the green concrete walls like a pistol shot. He reached down, grabbed the memo from the lawyer's nerveless fingers, and held it up to the harsh light of the overhead bulb, inspecting the stamp with a grin wide enough to split his face in half. "Well, what do you know, Marcus?" Loomis said, his gravelly voice dripping with sweet satisfaction. "Looks like you did touch the ink after all, and right beneath your own official corporate seal. That's not a civil liability. That's a one-way ticket to McNeil Island with a federal escort." Thorne didn't look at the lawyer. He didn't look at Loomis. He looked at me, and for a split second, the polished, untouchable mask cracked wide open, revealing the desperate, cornered animal hiding underneath the three-piece suit. The veneer was gone. The grand facade had crumbled into dust right there on the scarred wooden table. "You're a meddling small-time nuisance, Nile," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling with a cold, venomous fury. "Do you think this changes anything? You think locking me up stops the machine? There are 10 men standing in line outside this precinct right now who will step into my shoes before the sun goes down. The waterfront belongs to us. It always has." "Maybe so," I said, standing up from my chair and buttoning the top button of my damp trench coat. "But they're going to have to run their operations without your signature. And trust me, Marcus, based on the math in that ledger, your replacement is going to find out real quick that the numbers never balance out in the end." I walked past Thorne, my shoulder brushing against his cashmere coat as I headed for the heavy steel door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The unmasking was complete, the ledgers were open, and the house had finally lost. As I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway of the precinct, the cool, clean air from the lobby hit my face like a splash of cold river water. The case had walked into my office 3 days ago as a frightened woman with an expensive handbag and a blood-stained shirt. It was leaving the station as a federal indictment, a couple of body bags down at the morgue, and a mob kingpin sitting in an interrogation chair, realizing his golden parachute was nothing more than a lead weight. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the damp matchbook I had salvaged from the garage, and tossed it into a metal trash can beside the precinct water cooler. Time to return to Pioneer Square. The office was probably still messy. The window was still cracked to let in the smell of roasting coffee and diesel fumes, and the electric bill was still sitting unpaid on the edge of my desk. But right now, sitting in a broken chair listening to the rain tap against the glass didn't sound half bad at all. Chapter 10. The rain had finally let up by the time I walked out of the municipal precinct, leaving behind a heavy, bruised twilight that smeared the neon signs of downtown Seattle across the wet asphalt. The air smelled of clean pavement, exhaust fumes, and the cold, salt-tinged breeze rolling in off Elliott Bay. I had my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my trench coat, my shoulders hunched against the lingering chill, and a fresh Chesterfield dangling unlit from the corner of my mouth. I wasn't heading back to Pioneer Square just yet. There was one last stop to make before I could close the file, cash the remainder of Clara's retainer check, and pretend I was a legitimate businessman who didn't spend his Tuesdays dodging bullets and tripping over mob enforcers. The King County holding facility was located 3 blocks south of the main precinct, an ugly soot-stained brick building that looked like it had been designed by an architect whose primary inspiration was a medieval dungeon. The waiting room smelled of floor disinfectant, damp wool, and the quiet, crushing despair of people who had made very poor life choices around 2 a.m. The duty sergeant on the night desk, a bored-looking guy with a head like a cue ball and a donut crumb stuck to his lip, took one look at my battered fedora and my damp trench coat, and immediately reached for his crossword puzzle. "Visiting hours ended at 8, pal," the sergeant muttered without looking up. "Come back Monday with a court order or a package of Lucky Strikes." I reached into my pocket, bypassed the damp matchbook, and dropped a crumpled $2 bill onto the scarred wooden counter, sliding it across the surface with my thumb. "I don't need visiting hours, Sarge. I just need 5 minutes with the star attraction in cell block C, Benny Rivas." The sergeant stared at the $2 bill for a long, quiet second. Then, with the smooth, practiced motion of a riverboat card sharp, his hand swept across the counter, and the bill vanished into his shirt pocket. He didn't blink. He just reached down, grabbed a ring of heavy iron keys, and tossed them across the desk. "Cell 14, the sergeant grunted, nodding toward a heavy metal door set into the back wall. "You got 5 minutes, Nile. If you stay 6, I never saw you, and I certainly didn't let a civilian walk back into the tank with a guy currently facing a first-degree murder rap." "You're a scholar and a gentleman, Sarge," I said, catching the keys out of the air. I pushed through the heavy metal door and walked down the damp, narrow corridor of cell block C. The air back here was thick and foul, smelling of sweat, cheap disinfectant, and the heavy metallic tang of fear. The inmates in the surrounding cells were mostly quiet, some staring blankly at the concrete floor, others tossing fitful turns on narrow cot mattresses that sounded like a nest of trapped crickets every time they moved. When I reached cell 14 at the end of the hall, I found Benny Rivas curled up in the corner on a steel-framed cot, his knees pulled tight against his chest. The rat-faced dock rat wasn't shouting anymore. He wasn't screaming about his innocence or thrashing against the bars. He was shaking from head to toe, emitting a low, pathetic, rhythmic whimper that sounded like a trapped animal dying slowly in a drainpipe. I stepped up to the bars, slotted the heavy iron key into the lock, and gave it a sharp twist. The bolt slid back with a loud metallic clack that made Benny jerk his head up like he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at me through the rusted vertical bars, his eyes bloodshot, wide, and completely unhinged. The grime and dried blood from the night before were still caked onto his cheeks, mixed with fresh tear tracks that cut clean paths through the filth. "Nile?" Benny whispered, his voice cracking into a dry, broken rattle. What are you doing back here? Did the cops, are they moving me to the gallows?" I pushed the cell door open, the hinges groaning loudly, and stepped inside. I pulled a wooden stool out from the corner, flipped it right side up, and sat down directly across from his cot, resting my forearms on my knees. "Relax, Benny," I said, pulling the unlit Chesterfield out of my mouth and twirling it between my fingers. "You're not going to the gallows. At least, not for Ruby Masters' murder." Benny blinked, his brain struggling to process the words through a thick fog of sheer panic. I don't get it. They found the gun in my pocket. They found her blood on my cuffs. Loomis told me I was cooked." "Loomis plays to win, Benny, and the precinct loves an easy close," I said softly, watching him carefully. "A jealous boyfriend with a hot temper and a smoking .38 sitting in his coat pocket. That's the kind of case a district attorney can unwrap in his sleep before heading out to the country club. But the truth is stubborn, Benny. It tends to stick around long after the easy answers pack up and go home." Benny stared at me, his chest heaving under his cheap, rumpled suit jacket. You know I didn't do it?" "I know you're an idiot, Benny," I said, keeping my voice flat and conversational. "I know you have a temper. I know you threatened Ruby because she was packing a bag to skip town with another man's money, and I know you pulled a gun on her in the heat of an argument. But you didn't pull the trigger. You didn't have to." Benny let out a jagged, broken breath, burying his face in his trembling hands. "I found her," he sobbed, the words muffled through his fingers. "I swear to God, Nile, I walked out to the alley to smoke a cigarette because I was so mad I couldn't breathe. I was there for maybe 5 minutes. When I came back inside, she was on the floor, bleeding out. Her eyes were still open, looking at the ceiling. And you panicked," I added, finishing the sentence for him. "You saw the gun lying on the floor beside her. You knew your prints were all over the handle because you had pulled it out to scare her a few minutes earlier. You knew if the cops walked in and found your piece lying there next to a dead body in a mob-run bar, you'd be swinging from a hemp rope before the week was out. So you grabbed the gun, shoved it in your pocket, and ran out the back door straight into the arms of a beat cop. Benny lowered his hands, staring at me with a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. How do you know that? Were you there? I don't need to be there, Benny. I just need to read the room, I said, leaning forward. Someone set you up. Someone knew you and Ruby were having a screaming match in the back room of the Blue Gardenia. Someone knew you had a hot temper and a registered firearm. And when they decided Ruby had to be silenced because she knew too much about Marcus Thorne's stolen ledger, they used you as the shock absorber. They dropped her, laid your gun down right beside her, and let you take the sprint down the alley so the cops would have a nice, neat, prepackaged suspect waiting for them in the driveway. Benny's mouth worked silently, opening and closing like a fish pulled out of the water. The full weight of what had happened, how close he had come to taking the fall for a professional mob hit, finally crashed down on him, turning his face the color of wet chalk. Thorne, Benny whispered, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. Marcus Thorne's people. Not just Thorne's people, I corrected him. Arthur Belmont's people too. They were all playing the same rigged game, Benny. And you were just a prop on the stage. For a moment, the cell was dead silent, save for the dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere down the concrete corridor, and the distant metallic clank of a closing gate in another cell block. Benny sat there on the narrow cot, his shoulders sagging, all the fight completely drained out of him. The tough guy act he liked to put on down at the docks was gone, stripped away by the cold, unyielding reality of the system. Then, something shifted behind Benny's bloodshot eyes. A spark of raw, ugly realization broke through the panic. They played me, Benny muttered, his voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper. He curled his hands into tight fists, the knuckles turning white against the gray skin. They sat there and watched me run. They knew I'd take the blame because I was just a low-life dock rat who didn't matter to anyone. That's generally how the math works in this town, Benny, I said, standing up from the wooden stool and slipping the Chesterfield back behind my ear. People with power write the equations, and guys like you and me spend our lives trying not to get caught in the remainder. Benny looked up at me, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate intensity. What happens to me now, Nile? If Thorne's lawyers get to me, or if the DA sticks me with this murder rap, I'm dead. Even inside these walls, a guy who crosses Marcus Thorne doesn't live to see his next parole hearing. Relax, Benny, I said, stepping back toward the open cell door. Thorne isn't worrying about you anymore. He's currently 3 cells down from you, waiting for his own high-priced lawyers to figure out how to explain a federal RICO indictment and a personal corporate authorization stamp on a $40,000 embezzlement ledger. Benny stared at me, dumbfounded. You broke the case? I just followed the paper trail, Benny, I said, giving him a small, weary nod. Loomis is filing the paperwork right now. You're still going to do a little bit of time for carrying an unregistered firearm and disturbing the peace down at a mob-run dive, but the murder charge is getting dropped by morning. The DA has bigger fish to fry, and you're officially off the hook for the main event. Benny let out a long, shuddering sigh, the first real breath of relief he had taken in 3 days. He slumped back against the stone wall of the cell, closing his eyes as his head hit the concrete block with a soft thud. Get some sleep, Benny, I advised, stepping out into the damp hallway and pulling the heavy cell door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sharp, echoing snap that sounded remarkably final. And next time a girl in a waitress uniform tries to skip town with mob money, let her catch her own cab. I walked back down the narrow concrete corridor, the heavy iron keys jingling softly in my hand. When I reached the front desk, I tossed the keys back onto the counter. The duty sergeant looked up, pocketed another imaginary invisible tip, and didn't say a word as I pushed past him and headed out into the cool Seattle night. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind a crisp, washed-out sky where a few stubborn stars were finally beginning to punch through the gray blanket over Puget Sound. I walked slowly back toward Pioneer Square, my hands in my pockets, the unlit Chesterfield still resting behind my ear. The streets were quiet now, save for the occasional clatter of a late-night streetcar rumbling down 2nd Avenue and the distant, mournful blast of a foghorn out on the bay. When I reached the 3rd-floor office in the Murphy building, I pushed open the frosted glass door, The lock was still broken, the linoleum was still scuffed, and the overflowing ashtray on my desk was waiting for me with open arms. I walked over, dropped my fedora onto the coat rack, and sank back into my squeaky swivel chair. I reached into my inside pocket, pulled out the remaining balance of Clara's retainer envelope, still crisp, green, and smelling faintly of a bank vault, and tossed it onto the stack of unpaid electric bills. I pulled a match from my pocket, struck it against the side of the desk, and finally lit the Chesterfield. I took a long, slow drag, letting the hot, sharp smoke burn away the last lingering taste of the waterfront. I stared out the cracked window at the dark, gleaming expanse of the city below. Just another Tuesday in Seattle, and the rent was covered for at least another month. I settled back into the chair, put my feet up on the edge of the desk, and waited for the next dame to walk through the door. Final chapter. The clock on the wall of my office read 3:15 a.m. Sunday morning, and the Murphy building had settled down into that deep, hollow quiet that only happens when every legitimate business for 3 blocks has been locked up for hours, and the only people left on the pavement are either looking for trouble or trying desperately to avoid it. The single overhead bulb cast a weak yellow circle of light over my desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the dead air and the small mountain of unanswered bills that constituted my permanent financial planning strategy. I sat there in the swivel chair with my feet propped up on the edge of the scarred wood, nursing a lukewarm glass of Old Granddad that had more icebox condensation in it than bourbon. The Chesterfield hanging loosely from my lips was burned down to a stubborn ash that stubbornly refused to fall off, defying gravity the same way I had defied about 6 different federal and municipal laws over the last 72 hours. The case of Arthur and Clara Belmont was officially history. Down at the municipal holding tanks, Marcus Thorne was probably keeping his expensive lawyers awake, arguing about jurisdiction and habeas corpus, while his multi-million-dollar waterfront smuggling ring was getting dismantled piece by piece by federal prosecutors who didn't care how many judges he bought for lunch. Arthur was trading his custom wool suits for a gray wool blanket in a federal penitentiary where nobody cared about his crossword puzzles, and Benny Rivas was back on the street with a bruised ego, a minor firearms misdemeanor, and a lifetime ban from every dockside dive between here and Tacoma. Clara and Ruby were resting in cold, quiet graves, leaving behind a trail of broken promises, looted accounts, and high-stakes double crosses that proved once and for all that human greed doesn't need any supernatural assistance to tear a city apart. Everything was wrapped up. The reports were filed in my head, the ledger was in the possession of the feds, and my pockets were lined with enough crisp green retainers to keep me in cheap booze and tobacco until the leaves turned brown next autumn. So why did the room feel about 30 degrees colder than it had an hour ago? I dropped my feet off the desk with a heavy thud, letting the wooden legs of the chair slam back onto the scuffed linoleum. I reached up, plucked the dead cigarette ash from my mouth, and tossed it into the overflowing ashtray. The smoke drifted upward, swirling into the dim light before vanishing into the dark corners of the ceiling. I stood up, my joints popping like dry twigs in the quiet room, and walked over to the cracked window. I pushed the wooden sash up another 2 inches, letting a gust of cold, damp Seattle night air wash over my face. The rain had cleared out entirely, leaving behind a vast, starless sky that hung over Puget Sound like a heavy gray wool blanket. Down on the pavement below, a lone beat cop walked his route, his heels clicking a slow, steady rhythm against the concrete, his silhouette stretching out long and thin under the flickering amber glow of a street lamp. It was a city of ghosts and ledger books. Every corner had a history, every dark alleyway held a secret, and every smiling face you passed on First Avenue was hiding a knife, a lie, or an unpaid debt. I reached for my worn-out gray trench coat draped over the back of the coat rack and slipped my arms into the sleeves. It still smelled faintly of salt water, diesel exhaust, and gunpowder, the permanent signature of a 3-day weekend that had cost 2 lives and nearly landed me in an oil drum at the bottom of Elliott Bay. I settled my battered fedora onto my head, pulling the brim down low over my forehead to keep the phantom chill out of my eyes. I patted my inside pocket. The heavy metal outline of my Smith & Wesson was still right where it belonged, riding comfortably against my ribs like an old, reliable friend who never asked stupid questions and never broke a confidence. I walked over to the door, turned off the sputtering overhead desk lamp with a sharp click, and plunged the office into absolute welcoming darkness. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy wood door shut behind me. I didn't bother locking it. The lock had been broken since the Truman administration, and anyone stupid enough to break into my office looking for valuables was going to walk away deeply disappointed by the state of my bookkeeping. The stairs down to the street level were steep, dark, and worn smooth by decades of boot heels belonging to debt collectors, bail bondsmen, and desperate people with stories that didn't add up. Every step echoed with a hollow, rhythmic thump that sounded like a bass drum beating out a funeral march for a case that had already been buried. When I pushed open the heavy street-level glass door and stepped out onto the sidewalk of Pioneer Square, the cold night air hit my lungs like a splash of river water. It woke me up, clearing away the lingering fuzz of bourbon and stale smoke. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a fresh Chesterfield, and jammed it between my lips. I flicked my Zippo. The flint was dry now, catching on the very first try, and shielded the tiny orange flame against the offshore breeze. The tobacco caught with a warm, steady glow, filling my mouth with that familiar, acrid bite that tasted like home. I took a long, deep drag, letting the smoke roll out past my teeth as I started walking south toward the waterfront. Nothing was really fixed. Marcus Thorne would be replaced by another shark wearing a nicer suit before the ink on his indictment was even dry. The docks would keep right on moving contraband through the fog. Cargo ships would unload pallets of untaxed goods under the cover of midnight, and girls like Ruby would still find themselves pouring drinks for desperate men who thought they could outsmart the house. Arthur Belmont had tried to rewrite the rules of a rigged game, and he ended up trading his freedom for a pair of handcuffs and a federal cell block. Clara had tried to double-cross the mob with a platinum watch and a fake inheritance, and she bought herself 6 feet of earth on Queen Anne Hill for her trouble. The world kept spinning on its tilted axis, greasy and indifferent, chewing up the small fish and spitting out the bones for guys like me to sweep up after hours. I walked past the old vaudeville theater, its marquee dark and peeling, and crossed the empty intersection toward the stretch of Alaskan Way where the massive gantry cranes of the freight yards stood like silent, rusted monuments against the dark horizon. A seagull shrieked out over the black water of the bay, a sharp, mournful cry that cut through the silence of the docks. I stopped at the edge of the pier, standing right where the salt spray drifted up from the pilings to kiss the cold asphalt. I pulled the Chesterfield from my mouth, let a long plume of gray smoke drift away into the night wind, and stared out across the dark swelling tide toward the invisible outline of the distant islands. "Case closed," I muttered to the empty air, the words swallowed instantly by the sound of the surf. I took one final drag of the cigarette, dropped the glowing butt onto the wet pavement, and crushed it out beneath the heel of my shoe. I turned my collar up against the biting wind, shoved my hands back deep into my pockets, and stepped out into the shadows of the Seattle night, ready for whatever sucker was waiting around the next corner with a pocket full of lies and a story that didn't hold water.